The man known to history as General Franco was born on the 4th of December 1892 as Francisco Franco Bahamonde in the coastal city of El Ferrol in the province of Galicia in the northwest of Spain. His father was Nicolas Franco, a descendant of an Andalusian family which had served in the Spanish Navy for 6 generations back into the early 18th century, and Nicolas himself would continue this tradition, working as an officer in the Spanish Naval Administrators Corps in the late 19th century. However, the relationship between Nicolas and his son Francisco would prove to be fraught, Nicolas being eccentric and a somewhat decadent character, traits which his son grew to dislike in his father. Francisco's mother was Maria del Pilar Bahamonde de Andrade, a native Galician from a well-to-do upper-middle-class family. Francisco would grow to become close to his mother, admiring her Roman Catholic piety and the serious demeanor she displayed in contrast to his father. As Francisco grew up, he developed a disciplined and serious character himself from a young age. He was originally destined for a career in the Spanish Navy, like multiple generations of the Francos before him. However, his family life was thrown into turmoil in 1907, when Francisco was just 14 years old. At this time, his father Nicolas abandoned his family and would soon marry another woman in Madrid. Francisco never forgave him and only maintained a limited relationship with his father for the remainder of his life. It is hardly a coincidence that just around the time that Nicolas Franco abandoned his family in Galicia, Francisco discarded any plans to join the Spanish Navy and instead entered the Spanish Infantry Academy in Toledo at just 14 years of age, though the decision was also partly attributable to the massive decline in the Spanish Navy in the aftermath of the Spanish-American War of 1898. Francisco eventually graduated in 1910 as a second lieutenant. His performance at the academy had been relatively modest, graduating towards the lower end of his class, but this can be partially explained by his age, many of the cadets at Toledo being 2 or 3 years older than Franco. The Spain that Franco now entered military service for was on the cusp of a protracted political emergency. Indeed, it had been enduring a very prolonged crisis in one shape or another for 2 centuries. In the 16th century, Spain had been the foremost European power, the superpower of its day, fueled by an enormous empire in the New World and huge gold and silver bullion flows from Mexico and Peru. However, in the 17th century, the Spanish Empire had entered into a period of rapid decline as those same bullion inflows from the Americas dried up, such that by the 18th century, Spain was a second-rate power with a backward, underdeveloped economy. Moreover, the country's politics were crippled by the excessive power of the Roman Catholic Church and an ineffective monarchy. Then, in the early 19th century, independence movements in South America and Central America robbed the country of most of its overseas empire. However, a reform movement was underway. During the first years of the 19th century, the country fell into the orbit of Napoleonic France, and a new generation of Spanish politicians was calling for a complete overhaul of the country's politics, economy, and society. A new liberal constitution was adopted in 1812, but tensions remained. As a result, the civil war, known as the First Carlist War, occurred between 1833 and 1840 over the succession to the monarchy and disputes between liberals and conservatives within the country. 2 further Carlist wars would follow in the late 1840s and the mid-1870s, the Third Carlist War having briefly seen the monarchy suspended and the First Spanish Republic created between 1873 and 1874. Thus, when Franco was born in 1892, the country had been subjected to nearly a century of conflict between left-leaning liberal reformers who wished to reduce the power of the monarchy, aristocracy, and Roman Catholic Church, and right-leaning conservatives determined to keep the traditional structures of Spanish society and politics in place. These twin forces would continue to dominate Spanish politics into the early 20th century and shape the course of Franco's life. At the time that he left the Infantry Academy in Toledo in 1910, though, the more calamitous political confrontations which Spain was to endure in the 1930s were still some way off. In the early 1910s, the Iberian state's main concerns lay in North Africa, where the country held some of the last vestiges of its once great colonial empire, having lost the bulk of its other possessions in the Caribbean and the Philippines in the late 1890s. In particular, Morocco had become a major focus of Spanish imperial activity. The country had held territories here for several centuries, notably the city of Ceuta across the Straits of Gibraltar. Spanish interest in the region had been further expanded in the First Hispano-Moroccan War between 1859 and 1860, and brief conflicts with some of the Rif tribes of northern Morocco in 1893 and again in 1909. A more substantial land grab was effected in November 1912, when a treaty was agreed between France and Spain, whereby Morocco was divided between them, Spain acquiring the entire north coast of the country and a strip of land in the south, while France took the more expansive central parts of Morocco. Yet while the agreement between the two European powers had established their respective spheres of influence, making a reality of Spanish rule in the newly acquired territory was a more protracted affair. Efforts to pacify the various tribes and political groupings in Morocco would occupy the attentions of the Spanish military for the remainder of the 1910s. Thus it was that Franco, fresh from the academy in Toledo, volunteered to take up a position in North Africa in 1912 at the age of 19. Franco's service in Morocco began his swift ascent within the Spanish military. In 1913, he was promoted to first lieutenant in an elite regiment of Moroccan cavalry. He became well known for his professionalism and command abilities, and also for the concern he showed for the well-being of the troops under his command. In 1915, he was appointed as a captain, the youngest individual in the entire Spanish army to hold that post. But the following year, in 1916, he suffered a serious gunshot wound in the abdomen. As a result, the young Franco, now just 24 years of age, was sent back to Spain and would spend the next few years back in southwestern Europe. The establishment of the Spanish Foreign Legion in 1920 and Franco's appointment as second-in-command of the newly established brigade was the direct cause of his return to North Africa in the early 1920s, as yet another war erupted between the Spanish and the Berber tribes of the Rif Mountains, one which would last on this occasion for half a decade between 1921 and 1926. In 1923, he was further promoted to the top command of the Spanish Foreign Legion, the same year that he married Maria del Carmen Polo, with whom he would have a daughter in 1926. Like her mother, she was named Maria del Carmen, and she would be Franco's only child. Shortly after their marriage in 1923, he was called to visit Madrid for an audience with the Spanish king Alfonso XIII. This meeting was indicative of the growing fame which Franco was earning within Spain for his military service in Morocco. Moreover, this occurred at a time when the power of the military was growing. In September 1923, the king endorsed what was effectively a seizure of power by General Miguel Primo de Rivera, who would head the Spanish government for the next 7 years with the slogan "Country, Religion, Monarchy," a clear indication of his desire to rule Spain along traditional conservative lines. Back in North Africa, Franco was instrumental in bringing the Rif War to a successful conclusion in the course of 1925 and 1926. His reputation now soared throughout Spain to that of a national hero, and on the 3rd of February 1926, he was rewarded with a promotion to the rank of Brigadier General. Franco was just 33 years of age at the time, and the elevation to the rank of general made him one of the youngest generals in any European army. 2 years later, he was appointed as the director of the newly established General Military Academy in the city of Zaragoza. These actions of the 1920s were crucial for later events, as Franco's subsequent rise to power in the 1930s was predicated, to a large extent, on the reputation he had gained for his command in North Africa, and also the loyal following he engendered amongst graduates from the academy in Zaragoza between 1928 and the early 1930s. The events which would eventually culminate in the Spanish Civil War and Franco's ascent to power have their origins in 1930. In late January that year, the effective head of the Spanish government since 1923, General Miguel Primo de Rivera, was forced to resign owing to a deepening economic crisis in Spain and public discontent with the direction of the country's politics. There now followed 15 months of political instability in the country, culminating in municipal elections in April 1931, in which the Republicans won over 40% of the vote, as opposed to just 25% for the monarchists. This was perceived as a referendum on the monarchy of King Alfonso XIII, one which he listened to the result of. On the night of the 14th of April 1931, just 2 days after the elections, he left Spain without abdicating. Earlier that same day, the Second Spanish Republic had been formally declared, ending the Spanish monarchy and ushering in a new period of Spanish politics. The leaders of the newly proclaimed republic now undertook wide-ranging reforms of the country, its economy, the role of the church, and the military. As someone who was closely associated with Alfonso's rule and de Rivera's government, Franco's career now stalled. He was removed from his position at the academy in Zaragoza, and the school itself was dissolved. Franco was a monarchist and was ideologically opposed to the Second Spanish Republic, but he nevertheless indicated his willingness to accept the new dispensation and work with the government in the early 1930s. This, however, was not enough to prevent the new government from effectively demoting him to a number of minor commands during the first years of the Second Spanish Republic. The new republic was bedeviled by instability during its brief life, including attempted coups and regional instability, all of which would eventually culminate in the Spanish Civil War. Before that calamitous conflict erupted, however, the country lurched from liberal to conservative regimes and back again. In 1933, the Spanish Confederation of the Autonomous Right were the victors in elections to the Spanish legislature, prizing power from the liberal parties, which had seized power in 1931. The 1933 elections were a boon for Franco's flagging career. He was restored to a more active command, and in 1934 he was promoted to Major General. That October, he was placed in charge of suppressing a violent revolt amongst miners in the province of Asturias, who were unhappy with the growing influence of the conservatives within the Spanish government cabinet. His successful prosecution of the Asturias insurrection would see him appointed as Chief of the Spanish Army's General Staff on the 19th of May 1935. The insurgency in Asturias and Franco's stated views on it also points to where his ideological views and personal politics lay by this time. Franco described the insurgency as a frontier war, one being perpetrated by socialists and communists with the goal of overthrowing civilization itself in Spain. Franco's anti-leftist credentials were being established in this manner just as the Spanish political landscape was lurching into its ultimate crisis. A series of scandals in the mid-1930s led to the dissolution of Parliament and the calling of new elections for February 1936. This occurred at a time when the country's politics had polarized to an unprecedented extent between a left bloc of communists, socialists, and radical republicans united into a coalition termed the Popular Front, and a right bloc of monarchists, conservatives, Spanish traditionalists, and ultra-Catholics, with the latter having a large amount of support from elements within the military hierarchy and the colonial administration in North Africa. Despite this coalition on the right, the left were victorious in the elections of 1936, and Manuel Aznar, the leader of the Republican Left Party, was quickly made president in a new government of the left. Azar's appointment as president in 1936 was the catalyst for elements on the right, and in particular within the military, to now begin plotting a coup d'etat. As this was occurring, Franco was effectively in exile. In February 1936, he had been sent to the Canary Islands as a military commander there, a position which was effectively a form of banishment from Spain itself. Up to this point, General Franco had largely remained aloof from any of the political parties in Spain, but he was now contacted by those elements within the military who wished to overthrow the government of the Second Spanish Republic in order to end the anarchy which had characterized Spain's politics throughout the 1930s. In June 1936, he met with the officers in question in a forest on the island of Tenerife to discuss the coup. At this point, Franco refused to commit to the insurrection, but in the weeks ahead, he did so. The revolt would be led by three individuals: General José Sanjurjo, a monarchist opponent of the Second Republic who was living in exile in Portugal, would be its symbolic head, while Emilio Mola y Vidal, 1st Duke of Mola, would lead the revolt on the Spanish mainland. Franco took command of the Spanish colonial armies in North Africa. The Spanish Civil War began on the 17th of July 1936, a day earlier than planned, when the Army of Africa rebelled in Morocco. The following day, Franco flew from the Canary Islands to North Africa as the rebel forces were seizing control of large parts of Spain. By the end of July, the insurrectionists, who were now referring to their broad coalition of political groupings as the Nationalists, had gained the support of elements throughout North Africa and in the towns and hinterlands of Zaragoza, Sevilla, Córdoba, Valladolid, Burgos, and Pamplona in Spain itself. However, the government, broadly identified as the Republicans, managed to maintain control over the largest cities, including Madrid, Barcelona, Bilbao, Malaga, and Valencia, with the two sides both holding or seizing substantial parts of the country. The stage was set for a prolonged and bitter conflict. This was exacerbated by the political, economic, and military aid which both sides were receiving. The Republicans would quickly be supported by Soviet Russia, while aid and direct military support was channeled to the nationalists by the Nazi regime led by Adolf Hitler in Germany and the fascist government of Benito Mussolini in Italy. Other nations, such as the United States, France, and Britain, declared their neutrality but could not stop independent brigades forming and traveling to Spain to fight on behalf of one side or the other. As a result of all this, the Spanish Civil War became a proxy war in the wider showdown between the political right and left in Europe in the years prior to the outbreak of the Second World War. It also acted as a means of trialling the new developments in military hardware which had been made since the First World War, notably the rapid advances in airplanes which had occurred since the 1910s. The Civil War itself became a long war of attrition. Having quickly seized the Spanish protectorate in North Africa in late July 1936, Franco was able to convey a large proportion of the North African army, which consisted of approximately 30,000 men, to Andalusia in southwestern Spain in early August. He then began a march on Madrid, with the goal of seizing the Spanish capital from the Republicans and bringing the war to a swift conclusion. However, by the time he advanced on the city in October 1936, significant enough aid had been channeled to the Republicans by the Soviets and other communist powers that Franco failed to secure the Spanish capital. With this, the possibility of a short, swift victory for the nationalists had passed. As the war settled down into a protracted struggle in late 1936 and into 1937, the nationalists organized themselves into a provisional government at Burgos, a town to the north of Madrid, which had been a capital of the Kingdom of Castile and was a symbolic site for the nationalist government during the Civil War. On the 1st of October 1936, Franco was proclaimed Generalissimo of the Nationalist Army. He would soon become the supreme leader of the nationalists in the Civil War, as on just the third day of the rebellion, the 20th of July 1936, General José Sanjurjo had been killed when flying back to Spain from Portugal. Then, on the 3rd of June 1937, Emilio Mola was also killed in an air accident when his plane flew into the side of a mountain as a result of bad weather when flying to Vitoria in the Basque country. This left Franco as the undisputed leader of the nationalists in the Civil War and paved the way for his dictatorship in its aftermath. 1937 also witnessed the formation of the political party which would come to dominate Spanish politics until the 1970s. In 1934, in the firmament of Spanish radical politics prior to the outbreak of the Civil War, a new political party, the Falange Española, or Spanish Phalanx, had been established. This was effectively a fascist party in the vein of the National Socialists in Germany. It was far-right, anti-communist, and a champion of the Roman Catholic Church. Franco had not been associated with the Falange in its early years, but in April 1937 he now merged the fascist party with a number of other political groupings of the right in Spain, such as the monarchists and ultra-Catholic groupings to form the Falange Española Tradicionalista y de las Juntas de Ofensiva Nacional Sindicalista, meaning the traditionalist Spanish phalanx of the councils of the National Syndicalist Offensive. Thus, from the summer of 1937, Franco was the undisputed leader of the nationalists. The nationalists were also making headway in securing the more peripheral parts of the country. By early 1937, they controlled the bulk of the west of the country, with key strongholds in Coruña and León in the north and Sevilla and Granada in the south, while the Republicans retained control of the eastern coastal parts of Spain, the Basque Country in the northeast, and the central Meseta region, including Madrid. In 1937, the focus of military operations largely lay in the northeast, in the Basque Country, which was secured for the Republican cause in the early months of the war. A concerted effort to secure the area by the nationalists was undertaken in the spring of 1937. The Basque campaign has become infamous for the perpetration of the most notorious atrocity committed in the course of the Spanish Civil War. This was the bombing of the town of Guernica in northern Spain in late April 1937. It was carried out by the Condor Legion, provided by Nazi Germany, and the Legionary Air Force sent to Spain by Italy. Hundreds of Spanish civilians were killed in order to pave the way for Franco's subsequent capture of Bilbao in the region and the securing of northern Spain for the nationalist cause. The number of casualties is a matter of considerable contention, estimates ranging from several hundred to upwards of 1,000. These were largely civilians, and there is little doubting that it constituted a major atrocity by the nationalists. In the aftermath of Guernica, the nationalists made rapid advances in the north and northeast. The regional capital of Bilbao fell to them on the 19th of June 1937 after a 2-month-long siege, and the conquest of the Basque Country was completed in October 1937, bringing the nationalists into more secure control of the northeast and the Aragonese countryside further south. The Republicans, however, retained strongholds in the Meseta and all along the Mediterranean coast, including the cities of Barcelona and Valencia. 1938 was the critical year in deciding the outcome of the war. In the closing weeks of 1937, the Republicans attempted to retake the city of Teruel in eastern Aragon, lying inland from the Mediterranean coast, roughly halfway between Barcelona and Valencia. Their goal was twofold. If Teruel could be captured, it would better secure Catalonia for the Republican cause, while it was also believed that a pincer movement into the region would distract Franco from any attempt to take Madrid. The town soon became the focus of an intense confrontation between the Republicans and the nationalists. Both sides flooded the region with well in excess of 100,000 troops each in the dying weeks of 1937 and the first days of 1938. Franco himself diverted his attentions to Teruel just before Christmas Day 1937. Bloody and intense fighting between December and February would see each side suffer over 60,000 casualties, a death toll which was compounded by the worst winter that Spain had endured in 20 years. The Republicans eventually took the town early in January, before a sustained nationalist counteroffensive reclaimed it in mid-February, bringing the Battle of Teruel to an end. Teruel effectively exhausted the resources of the Republicans and has a significance for the course of the Spanish Civil War, far in excess of the strategic importance of the town itself. In the aftermath of it, Franco wasted little time in taking advantage of having gained the strategic upper hand. In early March, an offensive eastwards towards the Mediterranean coastline was underway, and by April, the nationalists had entered the provinces of Catalonia and Valencia, securing a large stretch of the Mediterranean coastline by mid-April. As a result of this offensive, the Republicans were suing for peace terms by the early summer of 1938 and had been reduced to holding the Meseta eastwards to Valencia and a small isolated pocket of territory in the northeast centered on Barcelona. The final push came in late 1938 and early 1939. On the 23rd of December 1938, the nationalists invaded Catalonia. Cut off from the main Republican strongholds between Madrid and Valencia, the leftists had little hope here. Tarragona fell on the 15th of January 1939, and a major event occurred on the 26th when Barcelona was taken by Franco's forces, an event which made it clear that the civil war was effectively over. Weeks later, the governments of Britain and France, which had previously tried to avoid officially favouring one side or the other, recognised Franco and the Phalangists as the official government of Spain. The Spanish Civil War was brought to an end in the spring of 1939. On the 6th of March, the Republican Prime Minister Juan Negrín fled to France in the face of an insurrection within the Republican military, which now sued for peace terms. A final military operation by the nationalists began in late March. On the 28th of March, Franco's troops entered Madrid, followed 2 days later by the capitulation of Valencia. On the 1st of April, Franco made a speech which was broadcast via radio throughout Spain, in which he declared victory for the nationalist cause. That same day, the last Republican stronghold, the Mediterranean town of Alicante, surrendered. After nearly 3 years, the Spanish Civil War was over. Franco was now the undisputed ruler of Spain. Franco's first weeks as the unequivocal head of the Spanish state were bloody. Leading historians of the regime estimate that at least 30,000 Republicans were executed in the weeks and months following the cessation of hostilities, while tens of thousands more were imprisoned. Hundreds of thousands more fled from the country, many leaving for South America, and approximately 500,000 streaming over the Pyrenees to France to find refuge there. For years afterwards, such persecution of Republicans and their families would continue and is one of the greatest crimes of Franco's regime. Although Spain's new leader aspired to rejuvenate the country in the aftermath of the war, he was to be instantly thwarted in this by events elsewhere in Europe involving his erstwhile allies. Nazi Germany's involvement in the Spanish Civil War had been just one component of a much wider pattern of German aggression throughout Europe during the mid to late 1930s. In March 1936, the Rhineland region of Western Germany was remilitarized. 2 years later, in March 1938, a more aggressive action was taken when Germany effectively annexed Austria into Greater Germany. Then, in early 1939, the rest of Central Europe was brought under Nazi control when parts of Czechoslovakia and Hungary were formed into puppet regimes or annexed. Britain and France had tried to appease Hitler and the Nazis as all of this was occurring. But when Germany invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939, it was a step too far. 2 days later, the governments in London and Paris declared war. One might have assumed that Franco would have been an obvious ally of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy when the Second World War erupted throughout Europe in September 1939. After all, both the Germans and the Italians had provided significant, perhaps crucial support to the Spanish fascists during the Spanish Civil War, and as a result had paved the way for Franco's rise to power. And yet Spain would remain neutral for the most part throughout the conflict. Franco's reasons for not joining the Axis powers during the war were mixed. In the autumn of 1939, the motive was sheer war exhaustion. The Spanish Civil War had only been brought to an end in April 1939, and there was a country to be rebuilt and civil strife to be recovered from when the issue arose of whether to join Hitler and Mussolini in their general war just a few months later. But Franco's stance in this regard shifted considerably in the months ahead, following the lightning-quick conquest of Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, and France by Germany in the late spring and early summer of 1940. The Spanish dictator indicated to Hitler in mid-June 1940 that he was willing to join the war. Negotiations to this effect were held at Unveiled in southern France on the 23rd of October 1940 between Franco and Hitler. But here the German Chancellor balked at Franco's demands for supplies from Germany and a promise of future control of Gibraltar and French North Africa. Once these early negotiations to bring Spain directly into the war on the side of the Axis powers failed, Franco generally steered an opportunistic politique course for the remainder of the war. For instance, he sanctioned the formation of a unit of Spanish volunteers to serve in the German war effort, but strictly stipulated that this blue division was only to be allowed to serve on the Eastern Front against Soviet Russia, as he did not wish to damage Spain's relations with the US and Britain. Similarly, Spanish troops were stationed in the Pyrenees from 1941 onwards to prevent against any attempt by Hitler to occupy the Iberian Peninsula for strategic reasons. More revealingly, Franco shifted his stance as the course of the war altered in 1942 and 1943, with the German armies having been stopped on the Eastern Front and then forced into a retreat back towards Poland and Germany by the advancing Soviet Red Army. Franco saw that Hitler and his allies were doomed and accordingly began engaging in a more strict neutrality and was increasingly accommodating of the Allies from 1943 onwards. Allied troops who were downed in France in air missions could flee to Spain and were given safe passage back to their respective countries from the Iberian Peninsula. This certainly gained the appreciation of both the British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, and the US President, Franklin D. Roosevelt at the time. But Franco was not so well liked in the aftermath of the war by the Western powers. In the aftermath of the global conflict, Spain was not invited to join the newly established United Nations, owing to the sympathetic stance it had displayed towards Nazi Germany during the war, and the country under Franco was ultimately excluded from that international body until 1955. Once the Second World War concluded in 1945, Spain finally found itself free of either its own civil war being fought internally or a global war raging everywhere around it for the first time in nearly a decade. Indeed, the 30 years between 1945 and Franco's death in 1975 was, despite the dictatorship, arguably the most protracted period of political stability enjoyed by Spain since the 18th century. Francoist Spain, as it is known, was ruled by Franco as the supreme head of state, who took on the title of Caudillo de España, meaning the leader of Spain. There is little doubting that this was in essence a dictatorship, but it was one which became more optimistic in the aftermath of the Second World War. And although Franco courted the support of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy at the time of the Spanish Civil War, Franco cannot really be termed an ideological fascist himself. His was a military dictatorship, one which sought to foster the core values of the conservative movement which had formed one part of Spain's political landscape since the 19th century, specifically nationalism, support for the Roman Catholic Church, and an opposition to leftist politics, particularly socialists and communists. The Falange Española, which Franco had formed out of the various right-wing Spanish political parties in 1937, was the sole legal party in the country between the conclusion of the Civil War in 1939 and the end of the Franco regime in the 1970s. But there was also a distinct drift away from the party's fascist roots of the 1930s during the post-war period, symbolized in the rebranding of the Falange as the Movimiento Nacional, or national movement, in 1958. Yet this is not to suggest that Franco did not engage in harsh political repression. Trade unionism and left-leaning political organizations were generally monitored and suppressed, while many socialist organizations were banned by the state. Similarly, Franco's regime sought to impose a harsh suppression of the many regional separatist movements in areas such as the Basque Country and Catalonia, which have so characterized the history of modern Spain. Such policies, though, were only so effective. Indeed, in some instances they proved counterproductive. Attempts to curb Basque separatism, for instance, simply eventuated in the formation of the Euskadi Ta Askatasuna organization, or ETA for short, in 1959, meaning Basque Homeland and Liberty. ETA developed in the 1960s into a terrorist paramilitary organization bent on using bombings, assassinations and kidnappings to pressure the Spanish state in order to gain independence for the Basque region in northern Spain. Other authoritarian policies have cast a shadow over the Franco regime. Surely one of the most heinous aspects of Franco's dictatorship was the abduction of the children of Spanish Republicans and their fostering out to nationalist families. Much of the goal here was a form of social engineering, whereby these children, who would most likely be raised as left-leaning socialists and Republicans if they remained in their original family units, would now be raised as conservatives and traditionalists in line with the political ideologies of the Francoist regime. This practice had started during the Civil War, often involving children whose parents had been killed during the conflict, but it intensified to soon involve the children of Republicans who were arrested and imprisoned. It continued into the 1940s, before petering out in the 1950s, and eventually involved tens of thousands of children, perhaps into the hundreds of thousands. Many of these children never knew the circumstances of their birth or were never repatriated to their parents, and the legacy of what has been termed the lost children of Francoism was undoubtedly one of the worst crimes perpetuated by Franco's dictatorship. Elsewhere in the 1940s and 1950s, the powerful position of the Roman Catholic Church throughout Spanish society was cemented through Franco's policies. The Church's close alliance with Franco ensured that it was given almost complete control over the country's educational system, including Spain's universities, where lecturers and professors were screened for their Catholic credentials, and in Spanish society, divorce, contraception, and abortions were all prohibited. Most oppressive was the treatment of women in Spanish society. The Second Republic had adopted many of the progressive measures which had developed for women's rights in the United Kingdom and elsewhere, but these laws were now repealed, and women were increasingly confined to traditional roles in the 1940s and 1950s. As a result, women in Spain were prohibited from working in many professions and needed the permission of a husband or male relative to do something as simple as open a bank account. The middle years of the Franco regime in the late 1950s also saw considerable changes in Spain's colonial possessions in North Africa. In 1956, the French-held parts of Morocco gained independence, and the Spanish state simultaneously agreed to relinquish some of the territory it had acquired in northwest Africa nearly a half-century earlier. Yet this did not prevent conflict erupting between Franco's Spain and the Morocco of Sultan Mohammed V in 1957. The Ifni War, as it has become known, dragged on for 8 months into the summer of 1958 and resulted in Spain ceding Tarfaya to Morocco. Further territory would be ceded in subsequent years, and the Spanish colonies in the Gulf of Guinea were granted independence as Equatorial Guinea in 1968, whilst in 1975, shortly before Franco's death, a withdrawal began from the extensive territory known as Spanish Sahara, the sovereignty of which is still contested today between Morocco and Mauritania. Yet some small enclaves in northwestern Africa have been retained down to the present day, notably the cities of Ceuta and Melilla in northern Morocco. There were ambiguities to all this as time passed and the memory of the Civil War faded, and the regime became more liberal. The White Terror, as the Francoist oppression of the Republicans, both during and immediately after the war, has become known, petered out gradually in the 1940s. Though much of this was owing to the regime simply no longer having any enemies at home to persecute, concentration camps, which had been set up to hold Republican prisoners in the late 1930s, gradually disappeared from Spain. The last one, that at Miranda de Ebro near Burgos, was closed in 1947. By way of contrast, from the late 1950s onwards, and in particular during the 1960s, unofficially sanctioned trade unions began to operate in Spain and were not crushed or clamped down on in the manner which they almost certainly would have been had they tried to operate in the 1940s. In other ways, Spanish society was undergoing some limited liberalization from the late 1950s onwards. For instance, some of the restrictions on what women could or could not do were relaxed in the 1960s. Censorship of the press and the media also became less severe in the last 15 or so years of Franco's dictatorship, although any overt criticism of the regime itself remained a crime. Much of this must be viewed in light of the country's drift into the Western capitalist bloc of states led by the United States during the Cold War from 1955 onwards. As Spain found common ground with these countries, Franco became less authoritarian at home and more inclined to liberalize certain aspects of Spanish society. The ambiguities of Franco's dictatorship are most clearly evident when examining his economic policy. It is impossible to dismiss the success of Spain's economy during Franco's tenure as the Spanish head of state. Ever since the late 17th century, the country had languished in a state of seemingly perpetual economic backwardness, with a lack of industry and an over-reliance on unproductive farming methods carried out on large estates. All of this was compounded by the devastation caused by the Spanish Civil War, and for much of the 1940s, the country was on the brink of bankruptcy with only a meager economic recovery occurring. However, from the late 1950s, economic growth took off to such an extent that the last 15 or so years of Franco's regime has been dubbed the Spanish Miracle or El Milagro Español. In economic terms, during these years, the country had the second fastest growing economy in the world. Only Japan, which was undergoing its own economic miracle, grew at a faster rate between the late 1950s and the early 1970s. The Spanish miracle came about owing to a combination of factors, not least a series of national development plans devised by Franco's ministers and the adoption of a free market economy in 1959. Iron and steel factories proliferated in the northern provinces, and these in turn supplied raw materials for a thriving shipbuilding industry in the ports of the northern coast. Petrochemicals became a major national industry, and new corporations emerged, notably the SEAT Automobile Company. In 1946, there were just over 70,000 private cars in Spain. This number had increased to over 1 million cars 20 years later. More than 750,000 SEAT cars were produced during the years of the Spanish miracle. As a result of all this, Spain went from being one of the most economically backward countries in Western Europe to being the world's 9th largest economy by the end of Franco's regime. Thereafter, the global economic recession of the mid to late 1970s saw Spain's economic growth stall, but there is no doubting that the Spanish miracle hauled the country's economy out of the stagnation in which it had wallowed for 2 centuries and brought it into the 20th century. This, combined with the massive expansion of the tourism sector in the post-Franco period, created the economy of modern Spain, and whatever his other failings and crimes may have been, this must be acknowledged as a major success of Franco's time in power. Perhaps in assessing Franco's career and the nature of his regime, we should also consider that he did not work to ensure the continuity of his dictatorship. This might have been partly owing to his lack of a male heir. Franco's marriage produced just one child, his daughter Maria del Carmen, born in 1926. Had the caudillo had a male heir to pass the dictatorship to, he might have made provision to ensure that this occurred, but he didn't. Indeed, Franco had taken steps to restore the Spanish monarchy as early as 1947, when an official referendum was held to make Spain a monarchy once again. Although it was passed, no new king was crowned at that time, and Franco instead had his powers as a regent for life ratified. As he neared the end of his life, though, he took more concerted steps to restore the monarchy, culminating in 1969 when Juan Carlos of the old royal house of Bourbon was named as Franco's successor and made a prince. 2 years earlier, steps had been taken to allow freer elections to the Spanish legislature. Then, in 1973, Franco resigned his position as Premier of Spain and head of the government in favor of Luis Carrero Blanco. Blanco was a long-standing ally of Franco's, who had fought with the Generalissimo in North Africa in the 1920s and during the Spanish Civil War, but his tenure as Prime Minister was short-lived, as he was killed by a roadside bomb by the Basque terrorist group ETA. In the final days of 1973, 2 further individuals, Torquato Fernández Miranda and Carlos Arias Navarro, would subsequently serve as Prime Ministers of Spain before Franco's death. But despite this partial relinquishing of power, Franco retained many of his positions, still serving as head of state, albeit in a much more limited capacity, and also retaining control over the Spanish military. Nevertheless, the measures taken from the late 1960s constituted some significant steps towards transitioning towards a less authoritarian regime. And at the end of Franco's life and following his death, the country would quickly transition to a democracy. This would come in the mid-1970s. By the late 1960s, Franco was approaching 80 years of age. His health was declining considerably. This worsened into the 1970s, in part because the Spanish dictator was suffering from Parkinson's disease. In 1974, he was sufficiently incapacitated on a number of occasions that his duties were passed in part to Prince Juan Carlos. His last official engagement occurred on the 1st of October 1975, when he gave a speech in Madrid, whereat he was said to have been particularly frail-looking. 4 weeks later, he fell into a coma and was put on a life support machine. There is some dispute as to whether he died on the 19th of November or in the early hours of the 20th, either from a heart attack or septic shock. His body was buried in the Valley of the Fallen, a huge burial tomb near Madrid, which had been constructed as a mausoleum and a memorial to those who had died in the Civil War, though it has recently been exhumed from here and removed to a family crypt on the outskirts of the Spanish capital. Although he professed a commitment to maintaining the system Franco had created and overseen for over 35 years, Juan Carlos moved to rapidly dismantle the authoritarian Francoist state as soon as the caudillo died in the early winter of 1975. A constitutional monarchy was established in the 3 years that followed. On the 15th of June 1977, the first free and open general election to have been held in Spain since 1936 took place, returning a high number of centrist and left-wing delegates to Parliament, an indication of the shift away from the right-wing politics of the Franco era. A year and a half later, a new constitution was ratified in December 1978. This has become the basis of Spain's modern constitutional monarchy, the total failure of an attempted coup d'etat in February 1981 by elements within the Spanish military who wished to see a restoration of authoritarianism in Spain was indicative of how quickly the country had successfully transitioned into a liberal democracy in the years immediately following Franco's death. General Francisco Franco is perhaps the most ambiguous of the dictators who seized power throughout Europe in the mid-20th century. He came to power as a result of a bloody civil war in which the conservative military bloc which he led was forever tarnished through a series of atrocities such as occurred in Guernica in April 1937, and through its associations with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In the 1930s and 1940s in particular, Franco's regime was responsible for the killing, arrest, or drastic interference in the lives of millions of Spanish civilians. This was especially the case in the aftermath of the Civil War, when the Spanish courts were dealing in the summary conviction and execution of hundreds of Republicans every day for months on end. Any assessment of his career must start by acknowledging this terrible legacy. But there is also little doubting that the Franco regime changed over time, in particular as it entered the 1950s. Francoist Spain became less repressive and, switching from an overt totalitarianism to a less brutal authoritarianism, there were also a number of considerable advances in Spanish society in the last 2 decades or so of Franco's regime, with a growing affinity with the US Western Bloc of powers from 1955, when the country was admitted to the United Nations. Most significantly, the Spanish economic miracle, which occurred between 1959 and the mid-1970s, finally hauled Spain out of the economic malaise it had been languishing in since the 18th century and made it one of the world's ascendant economic powerhouses. This created economic opportunities and prosperity for the Spanish working and middle class, which was unparalleled up to that point in modern Spanish history. This certainly does not excuse Franco's crimes, but it should be considered in any balanced appraisal of his time in power. And then there is the character of Franco himself. Who or what was he? He was an exceptionally private man, and the real Francisco Franco is hard to identify. Perhaps he might best be defined as a product of Spain itself, and one who shifted his own political stances in line with the prevailing trends of European and global politics between the 1930s and the 1970s. In the years leading up to the Civil War, he was a staunch advocate of Spanish conservatism, one of the 2 prevailing political stances in the country since the early 19th century. In this respect, he was an ardent anti-communist, a feature which was perhaps the most consistent aspect of his political views throughout his 4 decades in power. However, despite his ties to Hitler and Mussolini, Francisco Franco was not really a fascist, and in the course of the 1950s, the regime softened its stances considerably, eventually drifting towards closer ties with the US and the Western European states, as the Cold War made the right-wing Spanish regime a natural ally. Thus, Franco adapted to fit the prevailing political winds. Perhaps this was who he was in the end, a political chameleon, born of the chaos of Spanish politics in the age of extremes, which characterized Europe in the first half of the 20th century. What do you think of General Franco? Should we view him entirely in light of his brutal takeover of Spain in the 1930s, or did his later rule substantially rehabilitate him from his earlier crimes? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Augusto Pinochet was born as Augusto José Ramón Pinochet Ugarte in the city of Valparaiso, Chile's second largest city after the capital of Santiago, on the 25th of November 1915. His father, for whom he was named, was also Augusto Pinochet. He was the descendant of an 18th century French immigrant to Chile from Lamballe in the Brittany region of northwestern France. His mother was Avelina Ugarte Martinez, a woman whose ancestors had come to Chile from the Basque region of northeastern Spain. A great proportion of Chile's early settlers had come to the country from this region. She and Augusto Sr. had several children subsequent to Augusto Jr., who was their first child. Gerardo followed in 1917, then Avelina in 1918, Maria in 1920, and Luis in 1922. Augusto's relationship with his mother was particularly close, and years later, even when he had become ruler of Chile, he would continue to visit her every morning before going to work. He also seems to have acquired his ardent Roman Catholicism from her. The Pinochets were a middle-class family of the time. As a result, after being sent to the San Rafael Seminary School at Valparaiso for his primary education, Augusto was subsequently enrolled in the Sagrados Corazones, one of the oldest private schools in South America, which had been established in 1837. He studied there from 1928 onwards. At school, he was given the nickname Donkey, allegedly because of his braying laugh, but some people suspected it was a result of his poor academic performance. His school records reveal an average student, not the worst in the school, but very far from being an accomplished teenager. He did excel at maths, but struggled to even pass some other subjects. He also learned to speak some French, and, as was typical for the time in a profoundly Roman Catholic country, he learned a considerable amount of Latin. It was an unremarkable childhood otherwise, one in which he showed no particular affinity for any profession in particular. Perhaps it was unsurprising then that when he completed his time at Sagrados Corazones, Pinochet enrolled in the Chilean military school in the capital of the country, Santiago de Chile. It was the beginning of a long life in the military, which would profoundly shape the history of modern Chile. Pinochet grew up at the end of a period of unprecedented prosperity in South American countries like Chile. During the first age of globalization, roughly between 1870 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay experienced huge amounts of inward migration from Europe as the Old World's population expanded as a result of industrialization and improved health standards. As it did, tens of millions of Europeans left the Old World for the New. As a nation which faced the Pacific Ocean rather than the Atlantic, Chile was not a huge beneficiary of this migration, although a substantial number of Germans, Croats, Irish, and other immigrants did arrive. However, the country did benefit enormously from the economic boom that occurred across Latin America at this time. In particular, it developed a position as the world's foremost supplier of natural nitrates, supplying over 80% of the nitrogen used globally in fertilizers and agricultural chemistry. As a result of this era of prosperity, a relatively stable period of Chile's political history was entered into. Known as the Parliamentary Era, it was one in which the Chilean Congress largely controlled the country's politics rather than an overly powerful presidential executive. As successful as this period had been, the earliest years of Pinochet's life saw increasing tensions in Chile. The economy began to take a major hit from the 1900s onwards, as the rise of artificial nitrates reduced Chile's control of the global market. This problem became particularly acute from the mid-1910s onwards, as the First World War saw nations switching to alternative sources. Moreover, as elsewhere in Europe and in Latin America, the late 19th and early 20th centuries had seen the emergence of increasingly polarized left and right-wing politics in Chile, with the powerful landed upper class favoring conservative politics, but rising middle and working classes preferring reforming socialist presidents. Matters came to a head in 1924 during the presidency of Arturo Alessandri, when the Chilean military effectively engaged in a coup and a military officer, Luis Altamirano, became president. This was the beginning of a period of immense instability in Chilean politics. For much of the 20th century thereafter, the country would experience intermittent intervention and domination by the military, while the country's politics was increasingly unstable between left and right-wing groupings. All of this was compounded by a worsening economic situation, as South America was hit by the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression which followed it. While Europe and North America would eventually recover from the Depression, South America was hurt by it in ways that continued to have implications for the continent's economies for decades thereafter. Pinochet's early career mirrored that of many of Latin America's military dictators during the 20th century in that his life was largely unremarkable during his youth and into middle age. He specialized in military geography at the military school in Santiago in the 1930s, before graduating as a second lieutenant. Thereafter, he was assigned to a regiment stationed in the city of Concepcion in central Chile, before a brief assignment in his hometown of Valparaiso. In the early 1940s, he returned to the military school in Santiago to begin advanced training and studies as an officer. During these years, he married Lucia Heriat Rodriguez, with whom he would have 5 children, 3 daughters named Inés, Maria, and Jacquelina, and 2 sons, Augusto and Marco. The children were born as Pinochet continued to rise in a slow and steady fashion through the ranks of the Chilean military. By the early 1950s, he was working as a teacher at the military school in the capital, having carved out a reputation for some ability in the field of military geography, though how much any of this was based on any novelty in Pinochet's ideas is highly debatable. Notably in this regard, when he published some work on military literature in the late 1960s and early 1970s, much of it was plagiarized. Finally, in the mid-1950s, he was appointed as a professor at the Military Academy in Santiago, a significant enough position to have attained by his 40th year. Pinochet was beginning his ascent through the Chilean military during years when Chile's politics were beginning to stabilize in some fashion. After the chaos of the military coups and economic instability of the 1920s and early 1930s, some order was established from the mid-1930s onwards as the military's role in civil affairs declined and reforms were undertaken. These often combined a mixture of conservative and liberal policies and consequently managed to placate public opinion throughout all classes of Chilean society. The economy was also buoyed up by moves to nationalize the copper mining industry, with Chile rising to become the largest producer of copper in the world by a long stretch in the mid-20th century. At the same time, protectionist economic policies were implemented to grow Chilean industry at the expense of outside interests, notably American corporations operating in Latin America. Yet these were also years of political flux, as Chile found itself divided between supporters of a conservative brand of politics and a more radical leftist approach, one which embraced elements of Marxism and opposed American imperialism in Latin America. From the 1950s onwards, these divisions focused on efforts to elect a Marxist, socialist president of the country in the shape of Salvador Allende, the head of the Chilean Socialist Party. Allende's path and Pinochet's would become intertwined in subsequent years. Pinochet's rise through the ranks of the Chilean military continued during the late 1950s and into the 1960s. In 1956, he was one of several officers chosen to oversee a mission to the city of Quito in Ecuador. The more northerly South American nation was one of the least developed countries of the continent, but it had experienced a recent economic boom, owing to the expansion of the banana trade. As a result, the government had come to an agreement with Chile, whereby Santiago would dispatch a detachment of officers to Ecuador to aid the country in developing its first military academy. Pinochet would spend 4.5 years working on this assignment abroad, but it paid off. In the early 1960s, he was given command of his own regiment back in Chile for the first time, and in 1963 he was appointed as a sub-director of the military academy in Santiago. In the late 1960s, when Pinochet was in his 50s, he was promoted again, first to become the chief of staff of the 2nd Army Division and then as military intendant of the province of Tarapacá in northern Chile, where he had command of the 6th Army Division. This was an important position within the military hierarchy for him to have attained, but few would have believed that the man who arrived to Tarapacá in 1969, just over 4 years later, would stand at the helm of the Chilean state. Pinochet might have remained simply a senior military figure within Chile, a prominent one, but one whom the wider world would have heard little about had it not been for the outcome of the 1970 Chilean presidential election. That year, the Marxist Salvador Allende, who had run unsuccessfully as the Socialist Party candidate in 1952, 1958 and 1964, ran as the candidate of the Popular Unity Coalition, a coalition of left-wing parties and socialist groups. The election was a closely contested affair, one in which both the United States and the Soviet Union took a keen interest and active role. In the end, no one candidate won a clear majority, but Allende emerged victorious with just under 40,000 more votes than his conservative right-wing opponent Jorge Alessandri. Thus it was that Chile elected a Marxist as the head of state of a South American nation for the first time. In the months that followed, Allende initiated a radical reform program, seeking to expand government control over sections of the economy, notably through continued nationalization of the mining industry, as well as education reforms and changes in taxation and wealth distribution. This quickly brought him into conflict with Congress, where the socialists did not hold a majority. Meanwhile, the United States looked on, waiting for an opportunity to intervene to remove this dangerous socialist from power in Chile. Economic sanctions were also imposed by Washington to try to damage the Chilean economy and make Allende's government unpopular. By 1973, unrest at Allende's government was considerable in Chile as a result of the grave social and political unrest which persisted across the country, and the inability of Allende's government to address the problem without greater control over Congress. In particular, unemployment and inflation were rocketing upwards as US sanctions against Chile hit the country's economy hard, and this was the environment in which Allende's administration would be overthrown and a military junta established in Chile. It would bring Pinochet to power, but he was perhaps a very peculiar individual to end up fronting the opposition in Allende's government. He had, after all, benefited considerably from Allende's time in office. In January 1971, Pinochet had been promoted yet again, this time to become a division general and the general commander of the Santiago Army Garrison, a highly significant position in the Chilean capital. However, a fresh promotion quickly ensued following the assassination of the former Minister of the Interior, Public Works and Finance, Edmundo Pérez Zújovic, by left-wing terrorists while driving through Santiago in June 1971. In response to this, Allende imposed a military curfew in the capital and appointed Pinochet to hold supreme military authority in both the capital and the surrounding province. In the months that followed, Augusto demonstrated what seemed like a firm loyalty to Allende by cracking down strongly on protests against the president, work which saw Allende make him General Chief of Staff of the Chilean Army in 1972, one of the senior military officers in the country. But just a year later, Pinochet would be one of the leaders of the coup which overthrew Allende. The Chilean coup d'etat occurred on the 11th of September 1973. It was initiated by a broad coalition of senior officers within multiple branches of the Chilean armed forces and the policing services in response to the multiple crises facing the Allende government. It was also supported by the US government, which was actively opposed to any left-leaning regimes in Latin America in the context of the Cold War. Pinochet's level of involvement in the planning is unclear, but what is wholly evident is that he had just been made Commander-in-Chief of the Chilean army on the 23rd of August 1973, less than 3 weeks before the coup was initiated. Later, the leaders of the military junta would claim that the military coup was initiated in the autumn of 1973 in an effort to prevent Allende launching a military takeover of his own. In this light, it was claimed that Allende and his supporters in government had determined that the best way for them to be able to govern more effectively was to launch what was termed Plan Z, whereby they would seize greater control over Congress and the armed forces and thus be able to launch a more concerted policy program than the political deadlock of the early 1970s had allowed. It remains unclear to this day whether there is any truth to these claims about Plan Z, although it is not impossible. When it was launched on the 11th of September, the coup was resoundingly successful. At 7 a.m. that morning, the Chilean Navy captured the port of Valparaiso, the primary naval base in the country. Roads were soon being closed around it, and Santiago and the television and radio networks and other forms of mass communication were seized. Then the Air Force's involvement became clear, as other communication stations that had held out were bombarded. As a result, by the time that Allende and his ministers became aware of what was occurring later that morning, they were unable to communicate to the country or elements within the military who were not involved in the coup. By 8:30 a.m., the leaders of the coup were declaring that Allende's presidency was at an end, and by 9 a.m., they had seized control of all of the major cities except for the center of Santiago. Allende was now advised to flee from central Santiago and regroup in what would have amounted to the beginnings of a civil war, but he refused this advice, while also remaining determined not to resign his constitutional office. By midday, armed forces had closed on the presidential palace, and shortly after lunch, in what was one of the most ruthlessly effective coups in modern history, the leaders of it were able to declare that Allende was dead, and they were in firm control of the country. It was not at all clear as the dust settled on the events of the morning and early afternoon of the 11th of September 1973 exactly who was now in control of Chile, and the answer for a while was that no one individual person was. As occurred in several other South American countries during this era of military takeovers, a junta was established whereby a council of the chiefs of the various branches of the armed forces would rule in cooperation with each other. In Chile, this consisted of General Pinochet as the recently appointed commander of the Chilean army, Admiral José Toribio Merino as head of the navy, General Gustavo Lee, who was in control of the country's air force, and General César Mendoza, the commander of the country's national police, or Carabineros. This junta governed for the next 15 months, ruling Chile as a nation undergoing a period of emergency. Strict curfews and martial law were intermittently imposed. Opponents of the regime were arrested and held without trial, often being tortured or killed, and various other emergency measures were implemented. However, with the passage of time, a new dispensation was decided upon, whereby the 4 senior members of the junta would be appointed to the office of President of Chile on a rotating basis, with each one serving a term of 12 months before relinquishing the office to the next commander. Pinochet was given a turn first in December 1974, when he became the first post-coup president of the nation. He would not surrender the office for over 15 years. In the immediate aftermath of the coup, and indeed during the first year or two of Pinochet's tenure of the presidential office, much of the regime's focus was on consolidating its control over the country and crushing any form of left-wing or socialist opposition. During the mid-1970s, tens of thousands of individuals who were either associated with the regime or suspected of being so were arrested. Many were detained for extended periods of time without any proper judicial process, and often tortured or held under very harsh conditions. And these were the lucky ones, as they were eventually released. Others were detained, and then disappeared entirely, never to be seen again. There were thousands of these desaparecidos that disappeared. Many of these were first brought to the Via Grimaldi, a detention and interrogation center run by the Chilean secret services, where thousands of opponents of the regime were detained at various times during the 1970s. At least 240 of those who were taken here were never seen again, and it is assumed the regime executed them. Others were taken to various other locations throughout Chile where they were killed. While there is no explanation today, upwards of 50 years later, for where huge numbers of people went, it is estimated that at least 3,000 people were disappeared by the regime. Much of Pinochet's rise to power and control of the country for a period of nearly 20 years must be viewed within the context of the Cold War. Ever since the collapse of the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista in Cuba in the 1950s and the rise to power of the communist regime of Fidel Castro on the doorstep of the United States, successive administrations in Washington had been anxious to prevent the rise of any further socialist regimes elsewhere in Latin America. Accordingly, it had actively supported right-wing regimes throughout Central and South America and turned a blind eye to flagrant human rights abuses that were perpetrated by these same regimes, the most long-lived of which was that of General Alfredo Stroessner Matilde, the military dictator of Paraguay for over 3 decades between the 1950s and the late 1980s. In the first years of Pinochet's regime, this movement was given additional vigor across South America when the Chilean dictator launched Operation Condor, the code name for an agreement between several of South America's dictatorships to cooperate with each other in stifling democracy in their countries, trammeling human rights, and engaging in campaigns of state terror and murder. It would all be done with the collaboration of the United States intelligence services. For many Chileans, the change of the regime in 1973 was marked by the disappearance of a family member or the detention of someone they knew for months or years without judicial process. But for most Chileans, the most evident sign of the altered situation in Chile was the striking array of economic reforms and changes that were implemented by the Pinochet regime in the 1970s and into the 1980s. As we have seen earlier, Chile had often favored left-wing governments in past decades, none more so than Allende's administration. As a consequence, the country had often favored policies that veered towards socialism, most notably in the proliferation of trade unions and the nationalization of services and industries. A particularly notable element of this was the nationalization of the copper mining industry, which had previously been dominated by American mining companies such as the Anaconda Copper Company and the Kennecott Copper Corporation. Nationalization of the country's major mines, the 3 largest of which were Chuquicamata, El Salvador and El Teniente, and which these American companies largely controlled, began in the 1950s and was finally completed by Allende's government. This was just one of the many visible signs of Chile's left-wing economic policies in the decades leading up to the coup of 1973. Pinochet's regime immediately set about reversing the left-wing drift of Chile's economy in the mid-1970s. A policy was established here during that time which sought to maximize the economic potential of the country by removing any form of protectionism or state control, in favor of allowing private business to play as large a role as possible in the free market. Thus, state services were privatized, government efforts to regulate major businesses were massively reduced, and American and other foreign companies, which had been substantially excluded from the country under Allende's regime or had left of their own initiative, were re-invited back into Chile. Much of this was owing to the wider international economic context. Pinochet first adopted this policy, which has been labeled as a form of economic shock therapy, in 1975. The global economic situation had taken a brutal blow in the year and a half between the coup of September and the adoption of this new economic platform, as a result of the energy crisis which followed from the Yom Kippur War of October 1973, when Egypt and other Arab nations went to war against Israel to reclaim the Sinai Peninsula. In the aftermath of this, Saudi Arabia led a large embargo against Western nations such as the United States, and this necessarily impacted on the economy of the wider Western world. Chile was particularly affected, as it had already been suffering from huge inflation and other economic woes under Allende. Consequently, Pinochet and his advisors decided to adopt this radical economic program in Chile to arrest the economic turmoil there. From 1975 onwards, foreign speculators were not only allowed back into Chile, but were also actively encouraged to come back, particularly large companies such as Dow Chemical, Firestone and ITT, which had been effectively removed from the country by Allende's government after it nationalized their holdings in Chile. International organizations were also invited in, notably the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and large loans were procured by Pinochet's regime to fund a domestic redevelopment program. Industries and resources which had been taken under state ownership in Allende's and some of his predecessors' times were also auctioned off to the highest private bidder. The one area where the Pinochet regime held out against pressure to re-privatize Chilean business interests was in terms of the copper mining industry. Copper mining accounted for a huge proportion of Chilean exports, by some estimates over 30% during the Pinochet regime, and as much as 5% of all economic activity in the country. The benefits of continuing to keep the industry under national control when Pinochet came to power meant that the ideological desire to privatize it once again was resisted, and in addition, the Pinochet regime established Codelco, a new state-run company, to oversee the massive domestic copper mining industry. All of this amounted to the earliest broad attempt anywhere in the world at introducing what are typically known as neoliberal economic reforms, ones which rejected the Keynesian economic school which had dominated Western economics since the 1930s. These are more usually associated with having emerged in the United Kingdom during the governments of Margaret Thatcher in the 1980s and her contemporary as President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. The legacy of neoliberal economic shifts such as these is still a matter of fierce debate. For instance, many claimed that free market-orientated reforms, such as Pinochet's government introduced in the 1970s, served to end economic crises in the short term, and began to lead to a rising standard of living for many Chileans in the 1980s. But as in a great many other countries where such reforms were introduced, many contend that over the long term they tend to weaken the fiscal power of the state itself, while benefiting big business. Furthermore, it could be argued that in the long run, wealth inequality between the rich and the poor in society tends to expand in countries which have adopted neoliberal economic programs. In Chile's case, this seems to have proved true, and as recently as 2019, protests erupted across Chile concerning historic levels of inequality in the country, which can be traced back to the policies initially implemented by Pinochet's regime. All of these economic changes were taking place as Pinochet was consolidating his hold over Chile. There had been an agreement following the coup of 1973 that once the initial period of martial law and political emergency ended, that the presidency would rotate between the leading figures of the armed forces, navy, Air Force and police services, with Pinochet initially only meant to serve 12 months before he handed over office. This would never occur. Once he was installed as president, he consolidated his grip on power throughout the second half of the 1970s, sidelining many of his rivals and granting himself ever greater powers. Much of this involved a skilled use of propaganda. For instance, the rank of Captain General of Chile was revived. This had only ever been held by Bernardo O'Higgins, the man who was known as the Liberator of Chile and who had been the most influential figure in the Chilean War of Independence during the 1810s and early 1820s. Now Pinochet sought to associate himself with O'Higgins' legacy and depict himself as a new national hero. His military hat was tailored to stand higher than those of other military officers, and in a country that was profoundly Roman Catholic, a cult of religion was developed, which proclaimed him as a visionary guided by both God and the Virgin Mary. As this cult of personality developed in the late 1970s and Pinochet's enemies were ever more diminished, statues depicting the president in an almost saint-like pose proliferated, some in town squares, some as statuettes which the average Chilean family were advised to keep in their homes. Giant posters of the military commander adorned public places. Much of this was possible because the Chilean military was one of the most rigidly disciplined in South America, and there was little room for contenders for power to emerge. Moreover, the secret police services, which had been developed in the weeks following the coup of 1973 to root out supporters of Allende's administration and prominent socialists, were now just as often being deployed to watch individuals within the government who might be plotting anything against the dictator. Instead of there being a wide bureaucratic state of government ministers and civil servants, the bulk of the day-to-day operations of government were often left in the hands of individuals who had been directly appointed by Pinochet and his close advisors. In this manner, Pinochet established a regime based on personal loyalty to him, and in which the anti-socialist dogma of national security became the justification for severe political repression. All of this was formalized in 1980, when Pinochet held a constitutional referendum to implement Chile's first new constitution since 1925. The proposed new constitution was to give the President of the Republic extensive new powers, a clear effort by Pinochet to solidify his control of the country, while the military junta, which had continued to exercise a large amount of legislative power years after the coup of 1973, was to be largely brought to an end. The choice for voters was clear. Did they want a continuation of Pinochet's regime with heightened powers for the president himself? If so, Pinochet would be appointed for a new 8-year term, following which a new referendum would be held at the end of the 1980s to decide on what would happen next. The result, when the plebiscite on this new constitution was held on the 11th of September 1980, was seemingly conclusive on the surface. 67% of voters approved the new constitution and Pinochet to remain in power for 8 more years. However, the result was immediately disputed by opponents of the regime who claimed that significant voting fraud had been involved. Whether this was true or not has never been concretely determined. In any event, the result was the same. On the 11th of March 1981, the new constitution came into effect, and with it, Pinochet began a new 8-year term as ruler of Chile. Pinochet's tenure during the 1980s was more troubled at the outset. The economic reform program, which had been adopted in 1975, despite being market-oriented and calling for a slimmed-down government apparatus, had nevertheless seen large amounts of borrowing by the Pinochet regime, largely to pay for goods and services. For a time, all of this yielded good results. In 1975, for instance, gross domestic product in Chile fell by 13%, industrial output plunged by over 20%, and unemployment was nearing 20%. This was all the result of the economic crisis, which started in the 1960s and worsened considerably under Allende, as huge sanctions were imposed on Chile by the United States. Additionally, Chilean inflation had exceeded 350% in 1974, making it the worst affected nation in the world in this respect at the time. However, by the late 1970s, the reforms proposed by the Chicago Boys, a group of Chilean economists educated at the University of Chicago, seemed to be reaping rich dividends as GDP began to rise, inflation declined dramatically, and the unemployment rate also stabilized and began to fall. For instance, after a modest increase of GDP in 1976 of about 3.8%, GDP growth rose to over 10% in 1977 and then stabilized at an average of 8% annually over the next few years. However, some of this success had been attained by manipulating exchange rates of the Chilean peso or taking on large amounts of debt. In the early 1980s, this became problematic as Latin America was plunged into a wider debt crisis. This occurred as countries that had borrowed heavily from the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund and countries like the United States were no longer able to service the interest rates on their accumulated debts, let alone pay back the principal. The Latin American debt crisis was so severe that it plunged the continent into what some economists have called a lost decade. Chile's experience was not as brutal as some of its neighbors such as Argentina, where the fiscal crisis contributed in large part to the fall of the military junta there and the restoration of democracy. But it was still significant. For instance, Chilean GDP fell to -11% in 1982, and the country's economy contracted by a further 5% in 1983. Thereafter, the situation stabilized somewhat, but growth rates would only average around 5% for the remainder of Pinochet's tenure as president of Chile. Thus, what has been referred to as an economic miracle in Chile, beginning with Pinochet's tenure, by some advocates of neoliberal economic theory, was not without its ups and downs. More broadly, the domestic situation during Pinochet's second period as president was seeing mixed results for ordinary Chileans. Often GDP and other ways of statistically assessing economic performance provide a skewed view of how people on the ground are doing. For instance, while Chile's economy did grow considerably overall during the whole 15+ years of Pinochet's dictatorship, wages actually decreased across the country, though it is difficult to assess this in real terms as inflation was so high in the early 1970s. Other indicators are clearer though. When it came to the sort of national services which the poor and middle class so often rely on, Pinochet's regime's performance was lackluster. State funding for such crucial things as housing, hospitals, schools, and basic utilities declined in general between 20% and 30% by the late 1980s on what they had been in the early 1970s. Thus, while there was a lot of wealth being generated in Chile and the economy was growing overall, this new wealth was being funneled into the hands of a minority of business people and those in high-income jobs, while international business interests also did very well out of Pinochet's regime. An indicator of how unaffected by this new wealth creation many Chileans were was seen in how unpopular Pinochet had become amongst ordinary Chileans by the late 1980s. Despite increasing evidence of its human rights abuses at home, Pinochet's regime continued to enjoy good relations internationally, particularly with major Western liberal democracies during the 1980s. Much of this must be viewed in the context of the Cold War. Pinochet's regime was perceived as an ally of the US in what was a period of renewed tensions between the Western world and the Soviet Union. It is notable in this respect that Operation Condor had sought to establish a cone of pro-US states in South America who opposed the growth of socialism in Latin America. This tendency only became greater in the 1980s as increasing tensions between the Soviet bloc following Russia's invasion of Afghanistan and rivalry over a new space race saw South America continue to remain an area of geopolitical tension. In this respect, while Pinochet's regime's record of brutalism towards its own citizens was dire, a policy of the enemy of my enemy is my friend prevailed. Curiously, this even extended as far as the US partly funding the construction of an extension of the Mataveri International Airport on Easter Island in the Pacific Ocean for use effectively as an American airbase. However, Pinochet refused to attend the opening ceremony in 1987 after Washington called on the Chilean president to address human rights issues in Chile more concretely. But despite such lip service, Reagan's regime was always willing to do business with the dictatorship in Santiago. There is no better example of this myopia towards Pinochet's regime amongst Western nations than the case of Chile and the UK in the 1980s. Pinochet's country began to drift closer to London in the late 1970s, owing to the two countries simultaneously developing tensions with Argentina. Pinochet's government had first developed close ties with the military junta that came to power in Argentina in 1976, but in the months that followed, tensions grew over some competing claims to lands along the southern borders of both countries in Tierra del Fuego and the Beagle Channel at the extreme south of the continent. Open war was only narrowly avoided between Chile and Argentina over this in the late 1970s, but in the case of a second conflict which Argentina was engaged in with the UK over the Falkland Islands, South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands at the same time, war did erupt in April 1982. The Falklands War would only last just over 2 months before ending in complete British victory, but as a result of it, Thatcher's government in London expanded its connections with Pinochet's regime. Thus, Chile and Colombia were the only two South American nations to actively support the UK position during the war by abstaining in a vote held on the conflict by the members of the Inter-American Treaty of Reciprocal Assistance, a coalition of states of the Americas, while Pinochet's government also provided extensive information about Argentina's strategic military movements during the war. Overall, the country's foreign relations under Pinochet were decidedly compromising for the Western world. Knowledge of the regime's brutality was manifest, and yet the US, Britain and others continued to treat the dictator as a close ally in a geopolitically turbulent period. This is particularly curious, as it was during the 1980s that charges of Pinochet being a latter-day fascist leader gained most currency within opposition circles in Chile and abroad. Much of this characterization came about because of the overt military nature of the regime which he presided over. Pinochet stood at the top of this, a rigidly hierarchical military setup, which was modeled on the old Prussian army of the 19th century, officers of which had acted as advisors to the Chileans at that time, and which had done so much to influence the development of the Nazi regime's military in the 1930s. This was further symbolized by the reference to Pinochet as "my general" by many within the administration and populace, rather than as president. Moreover, as we have seen, a cult of the leader had been cultivated in the 1970s, with large poster images and statues decorating urban spaces throughout the country. Thus, there was much to suggest that Pinochet's regime had become fascistic by the 1980s, but equally many scholars have been anxious to suggest otherwise, noting that Pinochet's regime was more in line with the military strongman type which countries like the United States were anxious to do business with during the era of the Cold War, than anything that resembled the fascists of Nazi Germany. What is clear is that while his official title was that of President of Chile in the 1980s, Pinochet was very much a military dictator. As the end of the 1980s neared, the question of Pinochet leaving power loomed large over the country's politics. The constitution, which had been voted on in 1980 and which had come into effect in 1981, had allowed for the president to commence a new 8-year term on an emergency basis. It was understood at the time that after this new 8-year term, a new referendum would be held to decide on whether or not Pinochet should stand for yet another term, or whether there should be a transition to a more democratic system. By 1987, opposition was growing to the prospect of Pinochet acquiring a new term. Much of this could not be stifled. Thus, when he outlined plans for a new referendum in 1988, one which would appoint him for 8 more years, running from 1989 to 1997, Pinochet was also forced to make the concession of legalizing political parties, something which had not existed in Chile for nearly 15 years. Moreover, he faced international calls to allow for a greater level of democracy in the country, notably by President Ronald Reagan of the United States, and also Pope John Paul II, whose influence was considerable in a fiercely Roman Catholic country. In advance of the referendum of 1988, a coalition of newly re-established political parties, such as the Socialist Party and Radical Party, joined with each other to form a coherent opposition, which campaigned extensively for a no vote in the referendum, one which would reject Pinochet's efforts to acquire a new 8-year term. They were ultimately successful, and when the referendum was held on the 5th of October 1988, the no vote passed with 56% of the vote. It is difficult to say if this means that 44% of Chilean voters continued to support him at this time, or if there was some electoral fraud and the dictator's popularity had fallen much lower. What we do know is that Pinochet tried to obstruct this democratic drive. several arms of the state, including the police and secret services, were deployed to try to create false flag national emergencies which would justify executive overreach. When these measures failed, Pinochet attempted to use the various branches of the armed forces to overrule the result of the referendum. But even the junta leaders of old had had enough. As a result, Pinochet was forced to acquiesce to demands for another referendum in 1989, one which led to provisions for a multi-party presidential campaign later that year. When it was held in December 1989, the leader of the Christian Democratic Party and a long-standing supporter of democratic reform, Patricio Aylwin, was elected. Pinochet thus left the office of president in March 1990, over 16 years after the coup of 1973 had brought him to the peak of Chilean political power. In the years following his removal from power, Chile began to transition back to the democracy that Pinochet's coup of 1973 had done so much to destroy. Pinochet's successor as president re-established the institutions of democracy and also formed a new National Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, which sought to investigate the excesses of the Pinochet years and bring closure to an immensely dark period in Chile's history. This mirrored a process which had been undertaken in neighboring Argentina a few years earlier in response to the end of its own military junta in the mid-1980s. This Truth and Reconciliation Commission resulted in reports which detailed the disappearance of thousands of Chileans between 1973 and the late 1980s, and the illegal detention of tens of thousands of others. But it did not result in any immediate repercussions for Pinochet himself, in part because the Chilean economy continued to perform well, though whether this was owing to the reforms of the Pinochet era or was the inadvertent byproduct of the global economic boom which followed the end of the Cold War in the 1990s is debatable. As such, Pinochet remained on as Commander-in-Chief of the Chilean Armed Forces despite the brutality of his regime, and he was also made a senator for life following the end of his tenure as president. This all changed in 1998. That year, Pinochet traveled to the United Kingdom for medical treatment for back problems, while there have also been allegations, which have never been proven, that he was there to simultaneously negotiate a covert arms deal. While he was there, Pinochet was arrested in October 1998 on the basis of an international arrest warrant which had been issued by a Spanish judge, Baltasar Garzón, on the grounds that over 190 Spanish citizens had been killed by Pinochet's regime in Chile during his time as dictator of the country, including the assassination of a Spanish diplomat, Carmelo Soria. Thus, Pinochet was arrested 6 days after the Spanish warrant was issued. He was subsequently held under house arrest for a year and a half in Britain, as the government of the British Prime Minister, Tony Blair, tried to determine what steps to take next. While detained, requests were made by the former Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, whose government had supported Pinochet's regime in the 1980s, to release the former dictator, as well as former US President George Bush. These implorations were ignored, and in March 2000, the UK government finally decided to extradite Pinochet back to Chile, where an agreement had been reached that Pinochet would be placed on trial to answer the charges contained in the international arrest warrant. Over the next few years, in what constituted the last period of his life, Pinochet's fortunes oscillated quite considerably. Precursors to this were seen when, despite the ignominious circumstances of his return to Chile after the issuance of an international arrest warrant and his detention in Britain for well over a year, he was greeted by cheering supporters upon his return to Chile in early March 2000. Clearly, the dictator still had a huge base of support at home, and even within the country's government. Thus, just days after his return to Chile, Congress passed a new measure to amend the Chilean constitution and impose a stipulation whereby an ex-president such as Pinochet could not be prosecuted for his or her actions while in office. An incredible sign of the support which Pinochet still garnered was seen in the passage of the amendment by a majority of almost 80% of members of the Congress. However, this support did not extend as far as the judiciary, and as a result, in August 2000, the Chilean Supreme Court voted to indict Pinochet for the disappearances of dozens of political opponents during the 1970s and 1980s. Yet in early 2002, before any judgment could be reached, the case was yet again dismissed on the grounds that the aging Pinochet, who was now in his mid-80s, was both physically and mentally incapable of standing trial. It seemed he would never be fully prosecuted. In 2004, the case of the former dictator and president took another turn. Early that summer, the Chilean Supreme Court once again overturned its former ruling and stated that Pinochet would stand trial. Evidence had come to light which suggested he had been engaged in a plethora of illegal behavior after his term as president, notably major bank fraud, money laundering, and secret arms deals in the 1990s. This, combined with confirmatory reports that despite his physical decline, the former dictator was actually sound of mind, combined to see a new decision taken to prosecute Pinochet with several crimes. Crucially, on this occasion, in addition to the charges of having been responsible for hundreds of disappearances, he was also directly indicted for specific assassinations. For much of the next 2 years, he would face repeated questioning and was often under house arrest. All of this was compounded early in 2005 when the Chilean Armed Forces issued a formal acceptance of and apology for its role in the atrocities of the Pinochet era. Pinochet remained defiant, though, claiming that if such actions had occurred during his long tenure as dictator and president of Chile, he simply could not remember such acts ever having been orchestrated. Pinochet was already an elderly man by the time he was arrested and then returned to Chile to face prosecution. As such, it was always unlikely he would ever spend time behind bars. But even the vague chance of this was terminated in the final weeks of 2006. On the morning of the 3rd of December, the former dictator suffered a heart attack. This did not kill him, but he did suffer such a setback that, as a 91-year-old man, he never recovered. He was given the last rites the day after the heart attack, though it took until the 10th of December for him to die from what was deemed to be heart failure and pulmonary edema. In a sign of the continuing divisiveness which his tenure as president provokes throughout Chile, spontaneous events broke out across the country when news of his death emerged, with some mourning his passing and others joyously celebrating. A decision was taken by the government not to grant him a state funeral, though his body did lie in state at the military academy in Santiago, and flags were flown at half-mast across the country in the days that followed. When he was buried a few days later, 60,000 people attended his funeral. However, the armed forces refused to sanction his burial on military property, and as a result, he was cremated and his ashes were returned to his family. Chile has come a long way today from the country it was during the 1960s and the early 1970s and what it became during Pinochet's reign. The country's politics have stabilized after the difficult years of transition which followed Pinochet's removal from power, oscillating between left and right-leaning governments. The country ranks in the top 50 nations in the Global Peace Index, ahead of other highly developed countries like France, South Korea, and Greece. It also has the lowest homicide rate of any nation in the Americas other than Canada, making it one of the Western Hemisphere's safest places to live, by way of contrast with the experience of life there in the 1970s and 1980s. And economically, it is one of Latin America's most advanced nations, coming in at 43rd globally on the Human Development Index and generally ranking first amongst South America's nations in economic terms. For instance, Chile has the highest gross domestic product of any South American country and is only challenged by Uruguay in terms of most economic indicators on the continent. Yet Pinochet remains a divisive character, with many still holding firm in their belief that his regime's economic policies and other measures pulled Chile back from the precipice of hardline socialism in the 1970s and paved the way for Chile's modern economic performance. There is no doubting that Augusto Pinochet was one of the most significant figures in the history of South America during the 20th century, and is the single most significant individual in modern Chilean history. This is perhaps all the more surprising, given the rather unspectacular manner of his ascent through the ranks of the Chilean military over a 40-year career, up to 1973, one marked by steady but in no way remarkable promotion. His rise to become dictator of Chile came about more as a result of having been rapidly promoted by President Salvador Allende in the early 1970s, and then benefiting from a coup which overthrew the same president in September 1973. However, once he became part of the military junta which came to power following the coup of 1973, he showed single-mindedness in pursuing power, which contrasted sharply with his earlier career. In December 1974, he became president of Chile, and he was determined not to relinquish control, only doing so a decade and a half later. Pinochet, it must be noted, has his fans. There were many people in his own time and subsequently in Chile and wider afield who perceived him as being a figure who guided Chile away from a destructive path on which it seemed to be progressing in the early 1970s. And indeed, there is no denying that Chile's politics and economy had been bedeviled by unrest between left-wing and right-wing elements throughout the 1960s and into the early 1970s. Moreover, there was a possibility that Chile would have drifted into the socialist camp in global politics if it had not been for the coup of 1973, a development which has created immense economic and political problems in many states worldwide, most notably Venezuela in South America in recent times. Supporters of Pinochet would argue that he prevented this slide and introduced economic reforms which paved the way for Chile to become the most prosperous nation in South America today. Many perceive the economic reform program championed and implemented by the Chicago Boys in Chile from 1975 as so successful that it inspired Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan to begin implementing similar measures in the UK and US in the 1980s. However, even if one takes this view, there is still no disputing the brutality of Pinochet's regime. While coups are never bloodless, the manner in which the junta and then Pinochet as president pursued the ideological opponents of the new government was especially bloodthirsty. During Pinochet's years in power, and particularly so during the 1970s, tens of thousands of people were detained by the government without any legal basis in Chile. Many were tortured or held for months without any justification, while at least 3,000 people were effectively murdered by the state, though they became known as the disappeared, as they simply vanished from Chilean society without any sign of where they had gone to. Much of this was instigated through Operation Condor, a program of state terror which was orchestrated by Pinochet's regime and which influenced the behavior of military dictatorships in neighboring South American countries. And all of this occurred while Pinochet and his family enriched themselves at the expense of the state, which he was purporting to serve. In the end, power and personal aggrandizement were what Pinochet sought, and these were pursued with a fierce brutality. What do you think of Augusto Pinochet? Was he one of the 20th century's most brutal dictators, who lined his own pockets at the expense of normal Chileans and persecuted his own people? Or is he redeemed somewhat by his more successful domestic policies? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as Leopoldo Galtieri was born on the 15th of July 1926 as Leopoldo Fortunato Galtieri Castelli in Caseros, a suburb of the capital of Argentina, Buenos Aires. His father was Francisco Rosario Galtieri, an Italian-Argentine whose parents had come to South America from Italy in the mid-19th century. In doing so, they joined well over 10 million Italians who left their home country in the space of the half-century between 1870 and 1920. A huge proportion of these migrants had moved to either the United States or South America, in particular Argentina, where Italian settlement was so intense that Italian Argentines replaced Spanish Argentines as the predominant ethnic group in the country during the 20th century. Thus, the Galtieris were in no way unique in their Italian heritage in Argentina, and, unlike in the United States at this time, where Italian ancestry was often met with prejudice, this would not present difficulties for Leopoldo in later years. Leopoldo's mother, Nelida Victoria Castelli, was also Italian-Argentine. Leopoldo was the second of her and Francisco's 3 children. The family were working class, and young Leopoldo and his siblings grew up in a fairly austere household. There was little remarkable about Leopoldo Galtieri's early years, or indeed for much of his early adult years. The events that would make him a well-known figure in 20th century history would almost all occur many decades later, when he was in his 50s and 60s. He was an average, though hardly accomplished student, one who was sufficiently astute to join the Argentine Military Academy when he was 17 years of age to study civil engineering. By this time, 2 twin passions were emerging for him. One was his love of engineering, a pursuit which would play a part in his rise to a position of authority in years to come, while the other was his zealous Argentine patriotism. Because of the massive influx of Italians to Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Italian Argentines came to view the South American country as their own homeland in the Americas, and in an age when 20th century nationalism was at its peak in the 1930s, 1940s, and 1950s, Galtieri developed an ardor for serving his country within its military services. Thus, in 1949, when he graduated as an engineer from a branch of the U.S. Army School of the Americas, operating out of the Panama Canal Zone, he determined on a career in the Argentine military long term. If Galtieri's early life was relatively undramatic, the period of Argentine history which he was living through was anything but. Having been a part of Spain's massive colonial empire in the Americas, which between the 16th and early 19th centuries stretched from Texas and California in the north to Tierra del Fuego in the southern extremity of the continent, Argentina had declared its independence in 1816 and finally emerged victorious from a war against Spain in 1824. A series of civil wars racked the country internally during the mid-19th century, but the half-century from the 1860s onwards was a period of political stability and economic and social progress. It is hard to imagine this in light of the civil wars, instability, economic backwardness, and military juntas which would come to characterize much of Latin America as the 20th century progressed. But in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, countries such as Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay, and Chile had booming economies and were as attractive to people such as Galtieri's grandparents when they determined to leave Europe as was the United States. In Argentina, the exploration and settlement of the rich lands of the Pampas pushed economic growth, and in 1913, Argentina was the world's 10th wealthiest state on earth in terms of per capita income. The economic expansion continued into the 1920s, around the time of Galtieri's birth, but a shadow was increasingly cast across Argentina's economic success by growing political tensions in the country. From the mid-1910s, Argentine politics was split between conservatives, who had overseen Argentina's economic miracle since the 1880s, and socialist radicals who were unhappy with the monopolization of Argentina's newfound wealth in the hands of small elites. The latter group was broadly led by Hipólito Yrigoyen, who became president of Argentina for the first time in 1916. Yrigoyen was also anti-American at a time when many nation-states across Latin America were becoming unhappy at US imperialism in the Western Hemisphere. Thus, for instance, when the US entered the First World War in 1917 and tried to coerce many of Latin America's nations into joining it in doing so, Yrigoyen organized a conference in Buenos Aires to object to this approach. He continued to serve as president until 1922 and was again elected for a second term in 1928 when Galtieri was just 2 years old. Yrigoyen's election for a second term would create political conditions in Argentina which would influence the course of Galtieri's entire life. In the autumn of 1929, just a year into Yrigoyen's second term as president, the stock markets on Wall Street in New York City took massive hits, which quickly spiraled downwards into a global economic recession followed by the Great Depression. After years of internal unrest, The shock of this was too much for the Argentine political system. In September 1930, a coup d'état was launched by General José Félix Uriburu, an army general and leading member of the Argentine Patriotic League. This overthrew Irigoyen's democratically elected government and established a military junta, which suspended the Argentine constitution and imposed a series of conservative presidents backed by the military throughout the 1930s and early 1940s. The political ideology of the junta during what subsequently became known as the infamous decade in Argentine politics was corporatist and fascist-leaning. This was also somewhat the case from 1946 onwards, when an Argentine general, Juan Domingo Perón, was elected president. Perón would hold this position for the next 9 years, during the period when Galtieri was gaining his first positions within the Argentine army. Peronism, a mixture of nationalism and populism, went on to dominate Argentinian politics for decades thereafter, and Galtieri was no less influenced by it than many of his contemporaries, though in a somewhat different fashion to most who actively identified as Peronists. The years of Perón's ascendancy saw some change in Galtieri's professional fortunes. In 1949, right around the time that he completed his military engineering studies, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant. This was followed in the 1950s by the award of the rank of captain and then major, while he served with the 4th Battalion of Sappers. Periods of time saw him seconded as a staff officer to the Argentine War College, where he was made a professor of military engineering. He also married during these years to Lucia Noemi Gentili in 1949, with whom he would eventually have 3 children, 1 son and 2 daughters. Despite the reality that Peronism would become a dominant strand within Argentine politics, it was proving problematic in the country at large by the early 1950s. Perón had favored a policy of economic nationalization and had promoted efforts to shift the economy from agricultural output to try to develop industrial self-sufficiency. By the 1950s, this was creating increasing problems, and Perón had angered many groups within Argentina through his wider social policies, notably the powerful Roman Catholic Church. Thus, in September 1955, a new military coup was launched by General Eduardo Lonardi. Perón fled into exile in Venezuela, and a new military junta came to power in Argentina. The late 1950s and 1960s saw Argentine politics continue to falter through periods of chaos. The economic situation continued to deteriorate under a number of military-backed governments, and efforts to redress massive trade imbalances by securing domestic sources of petroleum failed to yield major successes. Galtieri continued his own slow and steady progress up the ladder of military command during this period. In 1960, he was sent on a 6-month fact-finding mission with other Argentine army officers to Fort Belvoir in Virginia in the United States. A radical left-wing revolution had recently seen the Caribbean island of Cuba fall into communist hands, and the US was anxious to support right-wing governments elsewhere in Latin America, which might be at risk of falling into the socialist bloc in the Cold War. Galtieri was amongst those sent from Argentina to the US on this mission. On his return home, he gained another promotion when he was appointed to the Inspection Office of the Military Engineers, while in 1962 he was made a staff officer of the 2nd Infantry Division, followed quickly thereafter with a promotion to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. By 1964, he had been appointed as the Deputy Commander of the Military School of Engineers, and finally, in 1968, he was placed in charge of a battalion of military engineers, a senior position for an army officer in his early 40s. These years brought no end to Argentina's political troubles. In 1966, a new revolution, the Revolución Argentina, was launched by a cadre of military officers led by General Juan Carlos Onganía, who were unhappy with the direction of Argentina's politics since the mid-1950s. Onganía established a new military junta, where he served as president for several years leading up to the 1970s in what was effectively a military dictatorship. This new regime was immediately unpopular, both owing to its violent crackdowns on student and leftist movements and to its opposition to the church, while its efforts at corporatist economic reforms failed to arrest Argentina's economic decline. In 1970, the peso moneda nacional was replaced by the peso ley, while the currency was devalued overall by 30%. It was in this economic and political climate that there were renewed calls for the return to the Argentina of Juan Perón, who had spent most of the last 15 years since his fall from power in 1955 in exile. Perón and Peronism had remained popular in Argentina, so much so that several military juntas had banned it as a political movement. Now, in the early 1970s, it reached such a crescendo of support that Perón returned to Argentina in the summer of 1973. There, 2 million people awaited his arrival at Ezeiza Airport, and in September he won open elections with 61.85% of the vote, with his third wife, Isabel Perón, running as his vice presidential candidate. Galtieri was no supporter of Perón's, though his own time in office years later would exhibit some of the nationalist hallmarks of the populist leader. But despite his opposition to the former leader, Galtieri continued to gain promotions during Perón's new period of political ascendancy. Already in the 1970s, Galtieri had been made a commander of the Argentine Engineer Corps, while 2 years later, in 1972, he was promoted to the rank of Brigadier General and placed in charge of the 9th Infantry Brigade. But it was during the period of Perón's reascent to power that Galtieri's rise to become a senior military officer in Argentina really took place. In 1973, he was made the Chief of Staff of Logistics and Finance, while a year later he was promoted to the command of the more senior 7th Infantry Brigade. Finally, in 1975, he was made Deputy Commander and Chief of Staff of the 2nd Army Corps, and then the Chief of Staff for Operations, with the Army General Staff. This latter promotion placed Galtieri at the heart of the Argentine military. He was now acquainted with and regularly meeting with the senior commanders of the Argentine military, and armed forces which had played a central role in directing Argentina's politics for most of the previous half-century. And this promotion to the Army General Staff came just as Perón's government was once again running into trouble. Perón himself had been in his late 70s when he returned to Argentina in 1973 after his long exile. He was already suffering from several medical ailments by that time, not least heart disease and possibly the early stages of Alzheimer's. However, the election of his wife Isabel as his vice president in 1973 had been intended as a clear effort to put in place a Peronist line of succession within Argentina, which is exactly what happened. When Juan himself died in July 1974, Isabel Perón was sworn in as Argentina's first female president and one of the first female heads of state anywhere in the modern era. But Isabel Perón's administration faced immediate problems. The economic situation, which had been slowly deteriorating in one way or another in Argentina since the late 1920s, continued to worsen. Efforts to increase capital spending by Perón after his return in 1973 had simply resulted in spiraling inflation, which increased to an average of 300% per annum between 1975 and 1991. A series of economic reforms announced by Isabel Perón's economic minister, Celestino Rodrigo, only worsened the situation. Thus, by 1976, there were renewed deliberations within the military about intervening in Argentinian politics, and this time Galtieri, who had recently been promoted to the Army General Staff, was at the heart of them. On the 24th of March 1976, a right-wing coup led by elements within the senior officer class of the Argentine military, including Galtieri, overthrew the government of Isabel Perón. They had been discontented with her inability to adequately tackle the economic crisis in Argentina and deal with left-wing guerrillas in the west and south of the country. This new coup was led by Lieutenant General Jorge Rafael Videla, Admiral Emilio Eduardo Macera, and Brigadier General Orlando Ramon Agosti. They had planned the initiative since October 1975, and the government had become aware that a plot was underway early in 1976. Nevertheless, it was unable to prevent it. Galtieri was involved in the plot, but was not one of the most senior members at its inception. When it was finally initiated in March 1976, power was seized in just a matter of hours. Isabel Perón was placed under house arrest, where she would remain for several years. Thereafter, the military junta moved to seize absolute power. Unlike earlier juntas, which had seized power and then made provisions for heavily monitored elections, this new military junta aimed to hold power itself directly and to try to reform the country along the lines it saw fit. In the aftermath of its seizure of power in 1976, the junta, headed by Videla, Macera and Agosti, initiated a movement known as the National Reorganization Process. On the surface, this was a reform movement which aimed to tackle the fiscal crisis in Argentina and to try to bring an end to the decades-old political problems that had resulted in continuous clashes between conservatives and liberals. However, its methods were brutal, involving the unlawful detention of political opponents and a mass program of state torture and terrorism. Over the next years, in what became known as the Dirty War, the junta detained tens of thousands of individuals accused of being leftist guerrillas or Peronists. Many were never seen again. Much of this was undertaken in conjunction with US operatives as part of Operation Condor, an American initiative to support brutal right-wing administrations in Latin America. As a result of its actions, it is estimated that upwards of 30,000 people were killed by the military junta in Argentina in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Hundreds of thousands more had their lives upended by imprisonment and persecution. Galtieri, as a senior individual within the junta, was involved in the Dirty War right from the beginning, though his role would become more critical over time. Despite its efforts to brutally suppress political dissent, the national reorganization process continued to meet with the same political difficulties that, in one shape or another, had troubled Argentine politics all the way back to the early 1930s. The new finance minister, José Alfredo Martínez de Hoz, who arrived into office in 1976 as part of the new junta's first government, headed by Jorge Rafael Videla, attempted to introduce many free market liberal reforms to the Argentine economy, in the hope of redressing the economic situation by ending the decades-long effort to make the country's economy self-sufficient. A $1 billion loan was provided by the International Monetary Fund and Chase Manhattan Bank in the United States to kickstart the country's efforts, and this, combined with a number of other fiscal reforms, saw the Argentine economy show positive signs of change for the first time in many years between 1976 and 1978. But the improvement proved temporary. In 1978, the economy went into recession again and continued to run inflation levels as high as 175%. By 1980, the country would be running record annual losses on the national balance sheet of over $4 billion. Clearly, the national reorganization process was failing just as spectacularly as earlier regimes in its efforts to redress Argentina's economic malaise. Despite the ever-ailing situation, Galtieri managed to gain promotion throughout this period. He was a passionate supporter of the national reorganization process for all its brutality, and he continued to be promoted. In 1977, he was made a major general, establishing himself as one of the most senior figures in the Argentine military, and this gave way in 1980 to him being awarded the title of lieutenant general and being made commander-in-chief of Argentina's armed forces under the Videla regime. At last, after approximately 35 years in the armed forces, he had become the commander of his nation's armies. International recognition followed, with Galtieri visiting the United States in early 1981, where the administration of President Ronald Reagan, an anti-communist ideologue who wanted to bring the Cold War with the Soviet Union to an end, viewed him as a bulwark of right-wing policies in South America. This was a significant development, as some of Galtieri's subsequent actions were perhaps based on the belief that the US would increase its support for Argentina if the country pressed some of its territorial claims. During these years, a significant event occurred which prefigured some of Galtieri's actions in the early 1980s. Ever since the late 19th century, Argentina and Chile had been involved in a border dispute concerning the region at the very southern extremities of the South American continent, where both nations held various territorial possessions on Tierra del Fuego and the many islands there. At the very center of this was the line of demarcation between the two nations, around the Beagle Channel near Cape Horn. In May 1977, shortly after the national reorganization process had come to power, an international binding agreement had been made which granted the disputed lands to Chile. The regime refused to acknowledge this decision and instead determined to go to war with Chile late in 1978. As a result, Operation Soberania was launched on the 22nd of December 1978 with the aim to occupy some of the islands around the Beagle Channel and Cape Horn. This operation was eventually aborted, and within a few weeks, Argentina had consented to once again agree to arbitration, this time to be overseen by Pope John Paul II. These negotiations would drag on for several years, but the Beagle conflict is indicative of how the junta was willing to engage in warfare over small territories it laid claim to, and was increasingly relying on stirring up fears of an external enemy in order to calm domestic unrest within Argentina itself. Galtieri had assumed a position of considerable power in Argentina in 1980 when he was made commander-in-chief of the Argentine army, but there was slightly further to go. In March 1981, Videla agreed to relinquish power after 5 years as president, following the coup of 1976 and his own inability to lift the country's economy out of the doldrums. There was also increasing domestic and international attention being given to the tens of thousands of people who had been detained unlawfully by the state or who had just simply disappeared during the dirty war. His successor, Roberto Eduardo Viola, proved just as unsuccessful, and within weeks of his appointment as president in March 1981, factions were developing within the military that proposed alternatives to the recent incumbent as head of state. By the autumn, those who were discontented with the situation were coalescing around Galtieri as a candidate to become Argentina's next military president. What followed was effectively a coup d'etat in December 1981, at the end of which Viola resigned, allegedly on health grounds, but in reality because Galtieri had forced him out. What was particularly unusual about Galtieri's appointment as president of Argentina on the 22nd of December 1981 was that he did not now relinquish his position as commander of the military, but determined to run both the government and army at the same time. Galtieri moved to distance himself from some of the worst excesses of the junta and the national reorganization process under Videla's reign from 1976 to 1981. In particular, he loosened laws around expressing political dissent, and there was a visible increase in political rallies and protests throughout the country in the weeks and months that followed. However, Leopoldo was relying on the fact that he could win support for his regime through successful management of the economy and by building a broad base of political support. After all, Perón had managed this very successfully in the 1940s and 1950s, and perhaps a populist regime could yet again find success. And to bolster his position, he immediately began to seek the support of the United States, primarily by supporting the Central Intelligence Agency in its efforts to crush the left-wing Sandinista government which had gained power in Nicaragua in Central America in 1979. To that end, Argentina became a training ground for the Contras, a US-backed right-wing counterinsurgency movement in Nicaragua. It was possibly this relationship with the US that emboldened Galtieri to think that he could act aggressively on the world stage himself just months into his tenure as president, a decision which would have calamitous implications for his presidency. Galtieri's domestic policies followed in a similar vein to those of his many predecessors over the past 50 years in Argentina. in that his primary concern was to attempt to reverse the economic chaos that the country seemed to be constantly battling through. To this end, he appointed Roberto Aleman, a lawyer, economist and academic, as the new Minister for the Economy, a position he had briefly occupied 20 years earlier. However, where earlier Aleman had attempted to liberalize the economy in 1981 and 1982, he developed a major program of austerity whereby drastic cuts were introduced to public spending. The peso was devalued to tackle inflation, and a wage freeze was imposed, despite Argentina's by now perennial inflation problem. In order to acquire foreign funding and aid from the International Monetary Fund, he also proposed the privatization of numerous state-owned industries and services. These efforts, though, were broadly unsuccessful, in part because foreign buyers could not be found for some of the industries Galtieri's regime wished to privatize, and the economy, which had contracted by 6% in 1981, declined by roughly the same amount the next year, even after Aleman's reforms had had time to take effect. Perhaps what was more significant about Aleman's tenure as economy minister under Galtieri's government was the hostility it provoked from within Argentina. Already in 1981, the regime's policies had agitated the General Confederation of Labor, one of Argentina's biggest trade union organizations, notably the wage freeze at a time when inflation in Argentina was running at approximately 125%. A huge national strike had been organized by them on the 22nd of July 1981, following a wave of bank failures. A new strike was held on the 30th of March 1982 in Buenos Aires, where tens of thousands of workers showed up to protest, not just about economic conditions, but the nature of Galtieri's government more broadly. Protests were also held throughout the country in other towns and cities. At this moment of crisis, Galtieri did what many military strongmen have done throughout history. He engendered a foreign war to shift domestic sentiment in favor of the government. Just 2 days later, the general declared war on Britain over a long-standing territorial dispute relating to the South Atlantic islands of South Georgia, the South Sandwich Islands, and the Falkland Islands. If his intention had been to consolidate his control over Argentina, it was an ultimately disastrous decision. The islands which Galtieri had set his sights on were much like the territories around the Beagle Channel, which the junta had been willing to go to war with Chile over a few years earlier, of very limited economic and demographic significance. The Falklands had been uninhabited when Europeans first landed there in the 16th century, as were South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, which were not discovered until James Cook circumnavigated them in 1775. Britain claimed all three territories, but while these claims to South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands went largely unchallenged, in part because Britain allowed other European nations to establish whaling stations there and use South Georgia as a base for Antarctic exploration, Britain was involved in a dispute with Spain over the Falklands as early as the 1770s. The islands were named after Anthony Carey, 5th Viscount Falkland, who had sponsored a naval expedition led by John Strong in 1690, which landed there, while they were referred to as the Islas Malvinas by the Spanish. Argentina inherited Spain's claims to the island in the early 19th century after it gained independence from the Mother Empire back in Europe. This dispute intensified in the 1960s and 1970s, although at one point Britain considered relinquishing its claims to the Falklands as they were considered a financial drain on the British exchequer at a time when it was experiencing major economic troubles itself. Moreover, the actual value of the Falklands was very minimal, with a population of just over 1,800 settlers and a basic economy which was largely dominated by the fishing industry. This was the background to Galtieri's decision to aggressively push Argentina's claims to the Falklands. He was not the primary architect of this approach. Galtieri had come to power with two other powerful senior military commanders, Air Brigadier Basilio Lamidoso and Admiral Jorge Anaya. Anaya was the major driving force behind the idea to militarily seize the Falklands, South Georgia, and the South Sandwich Islands. The admiral believed that these remote South Atlantic footholds were so geographically remote from Britain and of such little economic value that the British would simply not respond if Argentina moved to unilaterally occupy them. To this end, Anaya had overseen the infiltration of some Argentine scrap metal merchants who traded in the South Atlantic with several Marines from the Argentine Navy. Then, when these were in South Georgia on the 19th of March 1982, they raised the Argentine flag on the island, an occurrence which gained international attention as it was seen as a hostile move by the Argentine government, though one which Galtieri and Anaya were able to claim ignorance of. In response to the flag-raising episode on the 19th of March, the British government dispatched the HMS Endurance, a Royal Navy vessel designed to operate in polar conditions, to South Georgia on the 25th of March. Up until this point, Galtieri's intention had been to delay a more direct assault on the Falkland Islands until much later in 1982. However, as fears increased in Buenos Aires that the dispatch of the Endurance to South Georgia was just the beginning of a ramping up of Britain's military capabilities in the South Atlantic, the Argentine president and his associates determined to act much quicker than planned. This was compounded by the massive strikes and protests that had been held across Argentina on the 30th of March. Thus, the invasion of the Falkland Islands was moved forward by Galtieri to the 2nd of April. It was intended to be a short war in which Argentina would gain an easy victory over an unresponsive Britain, but only part of this expectation actually came to pass. What has become known most widely as the Falklands War commenced on the 2nd of April 1982 with Operation Rosario, a military movement by the Argentinian armed forces against the Falkland Islands, the seizure of which was the primary goal of the conflict. The British had moved to reinforce the islands in March, but nevertheless, the garrison at Port Stanley, the main settlement of the archipelago on East Falkland Island, had less than 100 armed soldiers under the command of the Falkland Islands Governor, Rex Hunt, and Major Mike Norman. These faced an initial invasion force of over 500 Argentine commandos, which were deployed into the Falklands using 20 or so amphibious assault vehicles, which transported the men from the battleship, the ARA Santísima Trinidad. Landing at several locations in the early hours of the morning, the bulk of the troops headed towards Government House, where a spirited fight was maintained by the heavily outnumbered British for a few hours before Governor Hunt gave the order to surrender once it became clear they were hugely outnumbered. Thus, on the first day of actual combat between the two sides, Argentina occupied the Falkland Islands. This was an unofficial declaration of war. Neither side would ever actually declare war officially on each other during the conflict. Rather, Argentina dispatched its forces to the Falklands without any prior warning in order to benefit from a surprise attack, while the British responded by dispatching its forces to the South Atlantic, also without declaring war. The element of surprise made it seem like Galtieri's government was doing well in the initial week of the war. On the 3rd of April, just 24 hours after the Argentines had seized the Falklands, an Argentine force of Marines landed at Grytviken on the eastern end of the island of South Georgia. Much like on the Falklands, this force quickly overwhelmed the very limited defensive capabilities of the British there, and the island was also fully occupied by the Argentines by the end of the day. Yet it also became clear that day that these acts of aggression would be responded to. The United Nations Security Council passed Resolution 502 on the 3rd, stating that Galtieri's government's actions were a violation of international law and that they should remove their troops from the Falklands and South Georgia immediately. Despite this worrying sign that the occupation would not go unopposed, the impact of the invasion of the Falklands by Galtieri's government was immediate in relieving the political and social unrest which had been sweeping through Argentina throughout the reign of the junta since 1976, and in particular during the early 1980s. In March 1982, just weeks before Galtieri had ordered the invasion of the Islas Malvinas, the Argentine president had been facing protests in central Buenos Aires as he looked out from the Casa Rosada, the residence of the president in the city, at Plaza de Mayo. But just days after the general initiated the Falklands War, there was a complete about-face in Argentine public sentiment. Suddenly, the country was united around a nationalist cause, and where Galtieri had seen protesters on the plaza weeks earlier, he now saw Argentine flags being waved in support of his presidency and the junta in general. Perhaps as he looked out at this scene, the man who had slowly gained promotion through the ranks of the military over 30 years to finally achieve supreme power, believed his gamble was likely to result in a major propaganda coup, the capture of the Islas Malvinas and the stabilization of Argentina's ever-tumultuous politics. The weeks that followed would prove his confidence in this mission to have been profoundly misinformed. Galtieri very much had a direct nemesis in the Falklands War as it played out. This was Margaret Hilda Thatcher. Born in 1925, the woman who would go on to describe herself simply as a grocer's daughter had become the leader of the Conservative Party in Britain in 1975. This made her the first female leader of any political party in Britain's history. She subsequently went on to become Britain's first female Prime Minister following the general election of May 1979. In some ways, her own ascent mirrored that of Galtieri. The economic crisis which Argentina had faced in the 1970s and which led to the establishment of the new military junta in 1976 was replicated worldwide, though not as severely as in Argentina. Britain's economy had been in the doldrums for years, in many ways owing to high levels of taxation and what was believed to be an uncompetitive economy on the global stage. Thatcher entered 10 Downing Street, the seat of the British Prime Minister, in the early summer of 1979, arguing that the power of the trade unions in Britain needed to be diminished and a radical free market ideology adopted. She has divided opinion, not just in Britain, but globally, even years after her death. But what cannot be doubted is that she was an uncompromising figure who was equal to the task of confronting Galtieri in the war which now followed over the Falklands, South Georgia, and the Sandwich Islands. Britain's military response to the Argentine incursion which Galtieri had ordered into the Falklands faced several problems in the spring of 1982. It was the largest task force assembled by the British in a generation. This brought with it fresh challenges, as the High Command was utilizing novel weaponry for the first time in a live war, which had not been available in previous military engagements undertaken by Britain in Africa and elsewhere back in the 1950s and early 1960s. Moreover, this mission was being undertaken over 7,500 miles from Britain, while Galtieri was commanding troops from a much smaller geographical remove. The climatic conditions did not help matters either. In the spring of 1982, the Falklands and South Georgia were heading into the Antarctic winter, a period of extremely inhospitable temperatures, wind and snow. From a tactical perspective, the Argentine Air Force outnumbered the British air units deployed to the South Atlantic, although the Royal Navy did have missile systems that were more advanced than the Argentines, albeit they were untested in a live war as well. Perhaps most significantly, the British knew that they would be extremely weakened if their aircraft carriers, the HMS Hermes and HMS Invincible, were compromised in any fashion, whereas the Argentines were largely operating out of air bases in South America. Thus, the war effort was not as simple as many would imagine retrospectively. The war progressed slowly in the first week or so of combat as the British prepared their forces and sent them on the lengthy journey from Britain to the South Atlantic. On the 5th of April, the main task force centered on the 2 aircraft carriers left Portsmouth. The following day, Galtieri's government responded by dispatching large amounts of reinforcements in the form of Marines and ships to the Falklands, the theatre where most of the conflict would play out. However, the president was perturbed to see that he was decidedly losing the diplomatic war during these early days of April. Argentina's recent close ties with the Reagan administration in Washington had led him to believe that the United States would be tepid in its response, but Reagan quickly made his support for Thatcher's government clear. Then, on the 7th of April, the French government withdrew several technical assistance teams which had been operating in Argentina. Argentina's main neighbor in the southern inclines of South America, Chile, also came out in opposition to Galtieri's government. This was hardly a surprise given the recent conflict between the two nations over the Beagle Channel, and dozens of other nations made clear their opposition to the forcible occupation of the Falklands and South Georgia by Galtieri's regime. A further 3 weeks of limited engagements followed. The British declared an exclusion zone for 200 nautical miles around the Falklands to commence from the 12th of April. Meanwhile, the main task force arrived to Ascension Island east of Brazil on the 10th, where it remained in port for over a week as other ships and forces joined it. In tandem, Galtieri's government dispatched additional Navy units to the main theatre, amongst them the aircraft carrier 25 de Mayo and the cruiser General Belgrano. On the 21st, Argentine reconnaissance planes came within a few miles of the British task force as it slowly made its way from Ascension Island south to the Falklands. As a result of their findings, Galtieri visited Port Stanley in the Falklands on the 22nd of April and ordered additional troops and ships to be dispatched, based on the strength of the task force being deployed by the British. Other than these measures, the major development in late April was the seizure of South Georgia from the Argentines by a small British task force. The Argentines considered the island peripheral to the main conflict in the Falklands and had not heavily reinforced it, even withdrawing some of its troops owing to very poor weather in the southern hemisphere near to Antarctica as the winter set in. As such, it was retaken by the British with little effort. The slow progress of the British task force and the staccato nature of the war itself at this point were due to ongoing international negotiations that aimed to find a diplomatic solution to the dispute. These efforts were largely led by Alexander Haig, the US Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan's presidency. Reagan had approved a peace mission by Haig back on the 7th of April, and he had subsequently engaged in a whirlwind of diplomacy, visiting Buenos Aires on the 9th of April for negotiations with Galtieri and other senior members of the junta. He then headed for London for talks on the 12th to consult with Thatcher and the newly appointed British Foreign Secretary Francis Pym. After brief meetings here, he was back on a flight to Washington to debrief Reagan about the state of affairs in both capitals and what the likelihood of finding a peaceful resolution was. At this stage, it was realized that the ball was firmly in the hands of Galtieri's government. Either they withdrew from the Falklands and honored international law, or Britain would be justified in its military response. Haig accordingly headed back to Buenos Aires in mid-April, but made little headway. Accordingly, on the 30th of April, Reagan declared his support for the British response, and Thatcher's government announced further restrictions on any naval or air traffic passing within 200 nautical miles of the Falklands. Direct engagement between the two sides' main forces around the Falklands commenced on the 1st of May 1982. It immediately started to go badly for Galtieri and the Argentines. That day, the British bombed the airfield at Port Stanley, which the Argentines were using for their air forces, and followed this with an immediate landing of troops on both West Falkland and East Falkland Islands, the two main islands of the archipelago. More seriously, on the 2nd of May, the HMS Conqueror, an advanced nuclear-powered submarine, torpedoed the General Belgrano at approximately 1600 hours. The Belgrano had a crew of hundreds, and 323 men were lost when it went down shortly afterwards. Moreover, the knowledge that one of Britain's advanced nuclear-powered Churchill-class submarines was patrolling the waters around the Falklands led Galtieri and his fellow military commanders to order all Argentine warships back to port on the 3rd of May. This all amounted to a very ominous beginning for the Argentines in the Falklands campaign. While the sinking of the Belgrano had severely dented Argentina's willingness to keep its fleet in open waters, thereby granting naval supremacy to the British around the islands, their planes could make forays from the Argentine mainland. As a result, on the 4th of May, the HMS Sheffield, a British destroyer which primarily acted as a missile destroyer, was hit by an Exocet anti-ship missile launched from one of Galtieri's Super Étendard aircraft. This led to the ship foundering and the deaths of 20 crew members before the vessel was abandoned. It sank less than a week later. As a result of this setback of their own, the British were inclined to enter a renewed effort at mediation, this to be brokered by the United Nations and Peru. Yet even as these negotiations were proceeding throughout May, engagements were still occurring, and Britain dispatched more of its ground forces on ships from Ascension Island, where they had been readied. Much of the conflict continued to go well for the British, notably a raid on an Argentine airfield on Pebble Island on the 15th of May, where an ammunition dump and 11 aircraft were destroyed. On the 21st of May, 4,000 British troops landed at San Carlos in the Falklands, almost without opposition. An intense Argentine airstrike followed shortly afterwards, which did manage to sink the HMS Ardent, a Royal Navy frigate, but which did little to prevent the force build-up by the British on the Falklands themselves. These attacks continued throughout late May, with the Argentines sinking the HMS Coventry, the Atlantic Convair, and the HMS Antelope. But by now, Galtieri's forces were also losing a lot of planes themselves, making these attacks ever more impractical. It was a clear sign of the drift of events when Lamy Dozo, a member of the junta and head of the Air Force, sent a peace envoy to New York on the 25th of May. While negotiations continued amongst many sides, the conflict was nearing a conclusion, and one which did not look positive for Galtieri's regime. The British finally began their main land assaults on the Falklands on the 26th of May, as several units set out for Goose Green, and a larger force for Port Stanley the following day. The latter, the capital of the Falklands, was the ultimate goal. In the final days of May and early part of June, the British continued to spread out over the islands in preparation for their final assaults on the main garrisons and settlements. By this time, there were nearly 8,000 British soldiers on land there. In desperation, Galtieri's regime attempted a major air assault on the British Navy surrounding the islands on the 8th of June, one which resulted in major damage to British ships, including the Sir Galahad and HMS Plymouth, but this could not change matters on land. On the 11th of June, the main assault began on Argentina's main strongholds surrounding Port Stanley and the port settlement itself. Aided by 105mm guns and a heavy bombardment by several Royal Navy ships out to sea, the British quickly made progress and, on the 13th, moved in for the final push on Port Stanley. Heavily outnumbered, General Mario Menendez, who was in charge of the Argentinian defense of the settlement, surrendered on the 14th of June 1982, bringing the conflict to an end and restoring control over the Falklands to the British government. The Falklands War had lasted just 74 days, with much of the first month after the initial seizure of the Falklands and South Georgia on the 2nd and 3rd of April being primarily concerned with preparations and diplomatic negotiations. Thus, the conflict itself had been a whirlwind affair which was largely fought out in May and early June of 1982. The British had come out on top in the fighting, losing 255 men compared with 649 on the Argentinian side. The only area where Galtieri's side had succeeded was in sinking several major ships of the British task force, but it had done so at the loss of approximately 100 of its planes. Yet the end of the war also seemed like an anticlimax in some ways. Neither side had ever declared war, and the international consensus was that Britain had done what was necessary in expelling the Argentine military from its territories. As such, once the islands were back in British possession and Argentina made no further efforts to retake them, the war was effectively over, and no significant peace negotiations were necessary. However, the years following the conclusion of hostilities saw an increased British military presence around the Falklands and renewed investment in the islands and in their infrastructure and economy. The end of the war spelt a death sentence for Galtieri's presidency. The military humiliation, combined with a failure to address the country's economic woes and years of political unrest, saw him ousted from power just 4 days after the fall of Port Stanley to the British. He was briefly replaced by another military commander, Alfredo Oscar Saint-Jean, the former Interior Minister, who then handed power over to Reinaldo Bignone, the last of the Argentine presidents of the junta period. However, Bignone's time as president saw the gradual realization that the junta needed to come to an end, and democracy should be restored. Accordingly, Bignone called elections for 1983, but not before he and his officials had overseen a lengthy cover-up of the junta's many crimes during the Dirty War, notably the destruction of masses of documentation relating to the thousands of political opponents who had disappeared since 1976. This made the task of finding those who were responsible for the very many crimes of these years all the more difficult when Raúl Alfonsín, a social democrat and leader of the Radical Civic Union, entered the president's office on the 10th of December 1983, bringing over 7 years of military dictatorship to an end. The aftermath of the war in Britain could not have been more different for Margaret Thatcher and her Conservative Party. Time magazine named her its Woman of the Year in 1982 as a result of her leadership during the Falklands War. Then a general election was held early in the summer of 1983 to take advantage of the political windfall from the Falklands War. This, combined with an improving economic situation, saw the Conservatives win a landslide victory, and Thatcher began her second term as Prime Minister. Another major election victory ensured a third term in 1987, before Thatcher was brought down by individuals within her own party who were frustrated at the introduction of local taxes, colloquially known as the poll tax, and her increasingly Eurosceptic views. However, while Galtieri is remembered almost entirely on the international stage for his role in the Falklands War, Thatcher and Thatcherism has cast a much longer shadow over modern Britain, one which bitterly divides public opinion. This is because her more liberal economic policies and opposition to the country's more militant trade unions resulted in a marked decline in traditional British industry, while simultaneously causing the country's service industries to boom. Galtieri's life in the aftermath of the Falklands was lived in ignominy. Following the re-establishment of democracy in Argentina in December 1983, the new government moved to prosecute the leading members of the junta for their manifest crimes in terrorizing political dissenters and overseeing the illegal detention and murders of tens of thousands of Argentinians between 1976 and 1983. Galtieri was arrested in the dying days of 1983 and charged with human rights violations. As a former junta president and senior member of the regime, he was placed on trial in April 1985. Alongside the president from 1976 to 1981, Jorge Rafael Videla, Roberto Viola, and the other 2 senior members of the junta during Galtieri's presidency, Jorge Anaya and Basilio Lamidoso. This was all part of what the Alfonsín presidency termed the National Commission on the Disappearance of Persons. The trial concluded in September, and when sentencing was decided in December, most were found guilty of some level of wrongdoing. Videla, as the president for the majority of the junta's time in power and during the worst period of the Dirty War, was sentenced to life in prison, while Viola was given 17 years. Galtieri, Anaya and Lamidoso were acquitted of the worst human rights charges, but were subsequently court-martialed for their role in fomenting the Falklands War. As a result, in 1986, Galtieri was sentenced by the new democratic government to 12 years in prison. In the end, Galtieri would never serve even half of this time in jail. In 1989, after 6 years of the Alfonsín government, Carlos Saúl Menem became Argentina's next president. The new head of state decided on a more conciliatory approach towards Argentina's recent past, and shortly after his entry into office, he granted a pardon and remission of sentence to 40 of the former officers of the junta. Amongst these was Galtieri, and thereafter he attempted to lead a fairly incognito existence, living with his wife Lucia in a Buenos Aires suburb throughout the 1990s, and rarely giving interviews. However, the early 2000s brought fresh trouble. In January 2002, Eduardo Duhalde became president of Argentina and quickly determined that summer to reverse some of the decisions to pardon individuals like Galtieri back in 1989 by bringing fresh charges against him and others of the junta. Galtieri was due to stand trial for the disappearance of several dozen people in the 1970s, but his appearance at the trial was excused owing to ill health from a prostate issue. He would never see court, as he died shortly afterwards on the 12th of January 2003 of a heart attack. Subsequently, he was buried in La Chacarita Cemetery, a national cemetery in Buenos Aires. Argentina has in many ways never escaped the problems that characterized it from the 1930s onwards, and which allowed figures like Galtieri to come to power as part of military juntas and dictatorships. Those problems were largely economic. Initially, the restoration of democracy in 1983 and a few years of stable government ushered in a period of growth in the first half of the 1990s. However, towards the end of the decade, a new recession struck, resulting in a fresh financial aid package from the International Monetary Fund in 2000. This, however, could not stave off a run on Argentina's banks the following year and the effective collapse of the Argentine economy at the end of 2001. As recently as May 2020, the state defaulted on hundreds of millions of dollar debt payments which were due. Thus, the economic woes which began to beset Argentina following the Wall Street crash in 1929 have, in one way or another, persisted for over 90 years, making it one of the most unusual economies in modern history. And what of the Falklands? In 1994, when the Argentine government adopted several new changes to the country's constitution, these included a provision that the Islas Malvinas, the Falklands, were considered an Argentine province by law. However, the islands continued to be a self-governing British overseas territory, and there is no movement today to realistically transfer possession of them, South Georgia or the South Sandwich Islands, into Argentine possession. Leopoldo Galtieri was in many ways a rather pedestrian individual to have become president of a major nation such as Argentina. His early life and middle age were characterized by a slow and steady, but hardly impressively swift rise through the ranks of the Argentine military, first as an engineer and then subsequently with the general staff. Up until he reached his 50s in the 1970s, there was little to characterize his life that was singularly noteworthy. That, however, all began to change in 1976, when Argentina's tortured political landscape took another turn in its 50 years of chaos since the early 1930s. At this stage, Galtieri played a relatively senior part in overthrowing the government of Isabel Perón and bringing to power the national reorganization process and Videla-led junta. When this junta could not, like nearly all its predecessors in Argentina over the previous decades, find ways of stabilizing the economy and quieting political unrest across the country, it presented the opportunity for Galtieri to claim power himself in December 1981. Many, even within the military, must have been surprised that the capable but hardly remarkable military engineer of earlier years had risen to such heights. Perhaps what was most surprising about it all was how short and spectacularly unsuccessful his tenure as the Argentine head of state would prove to be. Galtieri's initial efforts in power ran into trouble straight away at home, and then he rushed into a foolish war in order to shore up support for his military junta. This would prove to be a dreadful error, one in which Thatcher's government in London showed much more resolve than had been expected by the military commanders in Buenos Aires. As a result, after a disastrous 10-week military campaign ended in mid-June in a comprehensive victory for Britain, Galtieri was not only removed from power in Argentina, but democracy was restored as the military juntas had their last gasp there. The remainder of Galtieri's life was spent in ignominy, oscillating between periods of prosecution for the human rights abuses and deaths he had been involved in of thousands of Argentines during the dirty war waged by the junta between 1976 and 1983. When he died in 2003, his demise was widely reported in the British press and other news agencies throughout the world. Few could find any redeeming characteristics to the man who led Argentina into the Falklands War. What do you think of Leopoldo Galtieri? Was he the worst of Argentina's many military rulers during the 20th century? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.